Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to miamighostchronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogman, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful.
Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good, I hope. Even though I know this is a little bit staggered, this is 1 week of after Thanksgiving. And everybody, I hope, had a good Thanksgiving. And for those of you who are old enough, once upon a time they had a really funny commercial that it was something like, the Partridge in a Pear Tree song, but it was like the 12 days of eating turkey and leftovers. And yeah, I had a couple of days like that where it was like, okay, I've had my fill of turkey for a good long time. So yeah, like when you think, how many dishes can you make with turkey? Yeah, something like that. So, and of course, now we're in preparation for the holidays, Christmas, New Year's, everything else. It's like, this home stretch to the end of the year. And again, I'm going to, because everybody had asked me about last year that I did that New Year's resolution hypnosis video. And they said, don't put it out so late. And I'm not. I'm going to be releasing it probably within the next week or so, as in what you need to do as far as making sure that the New Year's resolution is resolute. How's that? And because let's face it, this is the time that everybody, you know what the way to hell is paved with, right? The good intentions part. And subconscious as a way of basically sabotaging you really, really well, especially sometimes after, and I said this in the last video, after you spend a lot of money on gym memberships, clothing, dating apps, whatever, sites, anything that costs money, because everybody thinks, if I pay for this, I'm going to stick to it. Yeah. All right. So anyway, just check back, or more than likely I will announce it on the newsletter, which is why I urge everybody to sign up for the newsletter on Substack, because in there I make all the announcements about everything, the giveaways, things of this nature. I put on there weird articles about weird things, and I also put some of my older video interviews, anything. It's just a bunch of interesting stuff. So, but anyway, I have not forgotten about that. I have not forgotten about the New Year's resolution video. And I know a lot of people, believe it or not, they afterwards, I got a lot of comments and feedback saying, you know what? I hate to say it, but a lot of what you said, it's happened to me before. And it was like, yeah, been there, done that. And it was only after I worked as a hypnotherapist that I understood why a lot of times, it's the big hurrah, and by the way, it's not only our fault. There's a lot of commercialism that drives that. Like I said, right about, besides the holiday, the Christmas and the gift giving, you see all the big stores roll out all their exercise gear, vitamins, you name it, all the good intentions that people think that I'm going to do now. Yeah. We're pushed right along into that. But anyway, let's get on to the good part. Today I have a guest. This is the first time she's been here on Stories of the Supernatural. And she's an author. Her name is Vicki Joy Anderson. Okay. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She dreamt of being a writer just like her mom. So she started writing poetry when she was 10 years old. She went on to attend the University of Northwestern in St. Paul, Minnesota. She received a Bachelor of Science degree in English with a writing emphasis. Uh, but she says here in Northwestern, it was no ordinary institution. We were required to have a major in Bible. That's interesting. This has served me well as I have prayerfully stepped forward in the calling on my life, which is spiritual warfare and topics that are on the edges of fringe. It is very important that you know who you are receiving information from. I totally agree with that. And what their belief system is. She's listed the courses that, and this has been part of her, and she's going to give us, she's going to give us information. I'll provide it in the credit to the show as to where she lists the courses she took so that they can have confidence in her biblical education, which was a solid foundation for both her life and her writing. Okay. She's written and researched topics that the average American church ignores or denounces, and she came from towards them, or basically researched them from a bedrock of Scripture and an intimate relationship with God of the Bible. And she says here she was called to address these issues that plague so many believers and non-believers alike, shining light in the darkness, providing scriptural tools and weapons, helping them to break free from the dark ties that bind and leading the unsaved to Jesus. So help me welcome her. How are you doing today, Vicki?
Hey, Marlene, thank you so much for having me on.
On the contrary, it is my pleasure. So let me ask you, when you went to the university, did you know that they had that requirement, or did you on purpose go there because of that? How did that work out?
Well, it's really funny. I didn't want to go to college at all. I had enough. Junior high and high school were a rough ride for me. I got bullied mercilessly in junior high because I had surgeries every year. So I'd have surgery summer vacation. So I'm showing up at school with stitches still on my face.
Wow.
I mean, it was a rough ride, man. And high school, I didn't so much get bullied so much as I just got completely ignored pretty much. And some of that, by that point, it was my own fault because I was just pushed people away. But I was so sick of not school, but I was just so sick of humanity at that point. I was burned out on two-faced people and backstabbers and fake people. And I just thought I can't handle 4 more years of socializing with my peers and being in a dorm. And so I didn't want to go at all. And so, I kind of went to business college for a couple quarters and realized I don't want to be a secretary the rest of my life. I really want to be a writer. It's really what I want to be. And I wanted to be a writer since I was 10. And, my dad sort of had a hand in it. He was like, if you go to Northwestern, I'll pay for it. Because it's one of those situations like that's really where mom and dad wanted me to go. And I think that they saw, they tried to raise me in this Christian setting. And by the time I was college age, it's not that I had turned my back on any of that stuff, but I was so burned out. I was so bitter. I just thought that the world was just an ugly, dark, horrible place full of negative energy. And so I think maybe they were kind of secretly hoping that maybe this school could like straighten me out a little bit. Yeah. So I did go into it knowing that it was a Bible college, a Christian college, and you had this like 45 credit major. No matter what degree you picked, you had these 45 credits. And I'm really glad in retrospect that I had that 4 years of sort of guided learning, because I didn't know as a teenager how to read the Bible. And to tell you the truth, I don't think even most Christians who have walked with the Lord for 30, 40, 50 years really even know how to read or interpret the scriptures. Like it sits there, we pick it up every once in a while, we read through it. We don't really know what it means. We don't really have the time or the interest really, or the energy to like research it deeply. So we go to church on Sundays thinking the pastor is going to do all the hard work for us, but we really just kind of get rah-rah speeches. And a lot of this stuff on Sunday mornings is more man-centered, more people-centered, more make you feel good. Let's make sure all these people in a bad mood go home feeling good. Yeah. And one of the things that I'm kind of excited about in the era that we now live in, I think this is such an exciting time to be alive because we have a lot of Christians now who are delving into the supernatural aspects of the scriptures. Right. They're getting into Genesis 6 and the Nephilim the origins in the book of Enoch, the Watchers, the things that are really bringing the scriptures to light. I'm sorry, I got a major frog in my throat right now.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about that. That's the, my audience, they've heard me sneeze, cough, my dogs bark, my birds chirp, weird things fall, stuff. This is like, I'm sorry, this is not a soundproof studio and everybody knows it.
Oh,
but,
man.
But anyway, keep going. So and
it's
I
funny.
agree.
I was thinking, oh, Marlene, this is like the first podcast in like 60 episodes I've done where there hasn't been massive amounts of like tech issues. I'm like, yeah, we got it. Now I'm like, I can't talk.
Oh, believe me, every once in a while things go south. Stuff goes like it does. Just every once in a while. Yeah, the technology, supposedly the advanced technology.
Oh gosh, I know.
Backward step.
They're like, we're gonna shut her up one way or the other. But anyway, I feel like we're in this super exciting time because both sides of the table, I think, are excited about listening to each other. Because whether the church realizes it or not, that little black leather bound Bible that's sitting on your coffee table collecting dust, that is the most supernatural book out there. If you know how to read it. Now, unfortunately, most modern Christians are completely divorced from the culture, the context, the history, the language, and the geography of the original text. And because of that, we don't really, I think a lot of times we miss all of the supernatural aspects of a lot of those stories. Now, there's the obvious, like there's the miracles, right? We know that stuff, but there are things that go completely unnoticed. All sorts of things. You got to think of it in terms of like Joseph, for example, Moses, for example. These are guys that basically from boyhood or teenagehood up were raised in the homes of the pharaohs in Egypt and in Babylon. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were in the employ of the king of Babylon. Egypt, these places were steeped in magic and in divination and in secret knowledge, and the knowledge of, we call them secret societies now, but in the old ancient days, it was like the snake brotherhoods and, the blood covens and, all of these brotherhoods and things. And so it's not necessarily that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Joseph, and Moses practiced those things in the same way, but you better believe they had knowledge. These guys had occult knowledge. They understood. Right. Likewise, the occultists that were practicing all the magic, they had just as much of an awareness of the one true God, the Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, because they had been passing on stories for hundreds of years of the plagues in Egypt and the parting of the Red Sea and all of these things. And so there was an agreement and a knowledge of one another in ancient times that we've lost now. And now we have this separation, which I think is just all smoke and mirrors. I think the Christian church absolutely has to understand fundamentally, because of everything that they learn about spiritual warfare and the devil and hell, they have to understand, whether they like it or not, whether they want to delve into it or not, whether they want to focus on it or not, they have to acknowledge that the occult and divination and supernatural and paranormal things do exist. Likewise, the occult, New Age, science, medicine, all these places that pretend, that they don't know about all the biblical stuff, they really do too. And in fact, a lot of the occult is just a mirror image. It's just the taking of the scriptures and flipping it on its head and stuff. So there's, in many cases, I've met people in the occult that know way more about what's going on in the Bible than people who have sat in a pew for a very long time. And so what I really love about this topic, sleep paralysis, is it facilitates an opportunity for everyone on all sides to have a conversation about the same thing. And I think that, someone might not ultimately want to believe in Jesus Christ or buy a Bible or go to church, but there are things in that realm of knowledge that would be very enlightening to them. Likewise, a Christian might not want to delve into anything new age or occult, but there is so much information in there that they're not getting in church that will bring just more facets to the diamond. You know, we're holding this diamond, and most of us spend our whole lives looking at one facet. And so we see this one dimensional flat plane of beautiful glass. And if we only spun it around in every direction and realized it was this massive gem. And I'm not saying, hey, every religion should unite into one. I'm not saying that we all adopt and believe everything, but what I'm saying is we have to acknowledge that we're never going to put the pieces together and understand anything if we don't have all of the facets. And even Lovecraft, I think, alluded to this in the first paragraph of his Cthulhu story. It's brilliantly written, where he says that basically, in layman's terms, he's saying the only reason mankind hasn't gone insane is because all of the sciences and religions that were once all one body of knowledge, they've strained out now into opposite directions, and they're now light years apart, and no one connects any of this information together anymore. Now, even in the way we learn, even the way we learn in school, we have different subjects. In this class, we learn math. In this class, we learn history. If you go all the way back in time to the beginning, all of this knowledge was one collective puzzle. And we've split up all the pieces, and we've sprayed the pieces out light years apart, so no one connects them anymore. And what Lovecraft says is that once we start to go in reverse and we start taking all of these various studies and sciences and we start pulling them back together to the center and connecting all the dots, one of two things are going to happen. In one case, people are going to go mad. They're going to go insane.
Right.
And for the people who are able to sort of disassociate from the reality of it, they will continue forward and live in the new dark age. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that piece of alleged fiction.
Well, this is the thing, whether, any of Lovecraft's, whether it's the direct Cthulhu story or part of the mythos, of all the other, what he called the ancient ones.
Yes.
If you read even some of his other stories, he always spoke of them as in that the earth was much older. In other words, that's where these ancient ones. And now we're finding out, I mean, he wrote this, 100 years ago, more or less, some of his stories.
Yeah.
Now, archaeology and anthropology are finding evidence that, yes, that a lot of structures and bones and sites are much older than they ever anticipated, when they say, well, this is the Bronze Age and this is this age. And they're finding that civilizations are going much further back than what they wanted, the academics said
the narrative.
About 100 years, and it's like, and he's writing about, like you said, this fictional pantheon of gods, from this, universe, Cthulhu and all of that, it was like, that's exactly what we're saying, of course, woven into a fictional story. But and one of the things that I wanted to point out, because a lot of people think that Lovecraft, he was strange, but one of the things that Lovecraft always did was he pointed out that he never, he always made them that they were the enemies of mankind. It wasn't like he loved the Cthulhu's and Ithaqua, really. He never, he always made them the villains. How's this? Anti-humanity.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
And in most of his stories, even his followers or supporters in the end got punished by these gods themselves. So he had a very weird way of looking at it, but it makes you think, what was he, where was he, that source, that subconscious source where he was getting part of that information from, that he channeled it, if you want to look at it that way.
Well, he absolutely did, Marlene. And in fact, I talk a lot about Lovecraft in my book, because there's a great tie-in to his body of work. There's a lot of arcane knowledge in that fictionalized story. And, he talked a lot about his dream renderings, and he talked about in some of the trauma in his youth that led to these out of body and astral projection. And there's even biographers of Lovecraft who talk about the dream worlds of Lovecraft and how he said that a lot of his storylines came from these dream worlds, which we would call lucid dreaming. And sleep paralysis in many cases for people is just the precursor to lucid dreaming, out of body and astral experiences. And Lovecraft was one of many who sort of unabashedly talked about his inspiration coming from there. And so a lot of the people that have most significantly influenced our current culture from the 18th and 19th century that still exists today in the fields of medicine and psychiatry and literature, art, film. I mean, you look at Robert Monroe, H.P. Lovecraft, Frank Baum, Alice Bailey, Helena Blavatsky, they all talked about astral projection and ascended masters and automatic writing. And they greatly influenced our culture. But as we see from their own admission, they were receiving this information from elsewhere. And that goes all the way back to the book of Enoch, where the Watchers came down and Azazel gave the worthless mysteries of heaven, as to what Enoch calls it. They were sharing all of these arcane secrets of heaven. Unfortunately, they were the worthless ones. They didn't hang around in heaven long enough to get all of the, they kind of were high school dropouts, so to speak.
Well, it's true, like you said, when Blavatsky, these were all the mystery schools that supposedly their knowledge was supposed to be hundreds of years old.
Yes.
This was also when there was a rise of spiritualism, but at the same time, they had followers, but a lot of the things were also dismissed as in, forget it, they don't know what they're talking. And of course, this was also the advent, like you said, of the science. You wanted to be scientific, and unfortunately, a lot of times it was an either or. Either you were in the science camp or you were in the non-science camp. And if you were in the non-science camp, that meant you were superstitious, you were ignorant, that kind of, you believed in things like, magic. Yeah. So those two things didn't overlap, and in truth they can, but of course.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an obscure little verse in the New Testament where Jesus said, a prophet is never received in his hometown. And, basically meaning, hey, we know you. You think you're a prophet? Like, dude, I went to kindergarten with you. Who do you, so, but I think you could extend that to say that no prophet is received in their own era either. And I think a lot of times these things that are put out into the collective conscience, a lot of times these things are ahead of the times. They're not to be received in the era in which they were put out. It sometimes comes 50 years, 75, 100 years later. And this falls under the whole philosophical realm of the Overton window. They know a lot of times that what they're putting out there will be utterly rejected. But over the course of generations, what we reject, our children and our grandchildren will find cool. And so they know that as long as it gets out there, it will start to, become familiar. We become desensitized to what was maybe once horrible. And I mean, we see that in our current culture today. There are things going on now that if it was going on in the 1950s, there's no way it would be received. So it's just it's a psychological phenomenon, which is just another thing that I like to point out about these spiritual beings that we encounter. They are just absolute geniuses when it comes to toying with the mind, the will, and the emotions of mankind. It's sort of like taking candy from a baby in many cases, because they can manipulate our emotions. They can make us feel good, and they can make us feel peace and love and pleasure. They can make us feel enlightened. They can give us secret knowledge. And so these are all things that we as human beings who like to give the benefit of the doubt, or like anyone that would give me all these gifts as my friend. And a lot of times they're not.
Absolutely. Let me tell you something. It's called seduction.
Yes.
Hello.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks seduction is not. Everybody thinks of seduction as in within a romantic context, like romance, love, whatever. No, people can be seduced by different things in different ways, depending also on what your weakness is. Everybody's got that different weakness.
Yes, absolutely.
And like you said, and they know what your weaknesses. Let me ask you, when you wrote this book, that they only come out at night, which has to do with the weapon of sleep paralysis. How
Yes.
did you did you have sleep paralysis, or how did you decide to write that book?
I did. I've had sleep paralysis since I was, well, my first memory of it, my solid first memory of it, I was 4 years old, but I think it was
Okay.
happening before then because I do have an incident in my mind at another house where I was younger, where I was telling my mom I was afraid of the dark, and so I sort of wonder if it was happening before that, but it started when I was about 4, and,
Okay.
you know, I always tell people there's people that have more like impressive stories than mine. You know, I didn't have any of this being like dragged out of my bed and knocked into walls and raped and all this, gory stuff. But
Yeah, no, there's people that have had like really like very yeah, significant horrible sleep paralysis episodes.
yes, it can get very aggressive, very violent, very um, sexual. For me, it was the the trauma in it was the frequency. It just was night after night after night,
Really?
sometimes for weeks. Then it would kind of go away and then it would come back, but it didn't come back on any sort of cyclical, calendar. It was, you never really knew. And so you were always going to bed kind of on guard and never
Mhm.
really knowing. And, because of that, I kind of became this night owl. And to this day,
Right.
I'm up till like 2, 3 in the morning. I'm on this like the worst circadian rhythm you can imagine.
Sure.
But
People, yeah, it makes you hyper vigilant, which is a tough
yes.
thing.
Yeah, so sometimes you wake up just exhausted,
Yeah, I bet. I'm sure you
Yeah.
don't go down into REM sleep. How's that? A lot of times you
Oh,
probably don't go into REM sleep because
yeah, you don't. So it's interesting, and here are some of the things, and I'm talking about people who've been targeted from day one, like who they've been
okay.
hounded their whole lives, like because I know there's
Yes.
some people that, oh, that happened to me once, and I'm talking about the people
Mhm.
where this is like they've had it enough times where they're kind of trying to figure it out, and why am I a target, and is there things I'm doing that's triggering this? The people that have really, had to sort of live with it. The things that I find in common, and so this is kind of
Okay.
like my bullet point list. And so it doesn't mean that you have to have everything on this list, but typically the profile for the people that have it their whole entire life, the things that I'm
Okay.
noticing that when I talk to people, they often had some sort of childhood trauma early in life. And it could have been sexual abuse. It
Yes.
could have been given up for adoption. It could have been seeing a parent die or like losing a
Yes.
parent, seeing a parent murdered.
Absolutely. Yep.
But it could also be like in my case, the trauma was I had surgeries from 10 days old until I was like 15 or 16. So I had dozens and
Oh,
dozens of surgeries, left alone in the hospital for, quite a while because
yeah.
like we only had one car and my dad traveled for a living. And so there was a lot of times when the nurses would come in, with the needles and stuff, like mom's not there to protect you. And when you're a little kid, you
Oh,
don't
no, that's
you don't understand, like your brain doesn't differentiate. Hey, every time mom leaves, a stranger comes in and
yeah.
pokes me in the arm. Like you don't
Well, the thing
process
is
that.
this, that people think of trauma as just being physical trauma,
Yes.
but there's such a thing as emotional trauma, all
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Which is
Psychological.
just as damaging. Yeah, the emotional, psychological is not physical, you know,
Yep.
but that emotional, that especially like you said, as a child, it's very difficult to logic that.
It
Uh
is, and it's detrimental to the developing brain.
yes.
There's things that get locked into your head, and believe me, I'm aware of them now. I'm 50 years old, and I'm aware of
Hmm.
what these triggers are and this and that, and there's just a point where some of this stuff just is so embedded into
Hmm.
your personality now that even you can logicize with yourself like, Vic, this does not make any sense, why you can trust this person, like settle down. And it's just
Right,
like,
right.
ooh. But
Yes.
so a
But
lot of people will say trauma. I also
mhm.
noticed that a lot of people that have this over the course of their whole life and have trouble shaking it, they're usually empaths,
Okay.
very empathetic to feeling other people's pain and sorrow, to the point
Mhm.
where a lot of people think that people who've been through trauma isolate themselves because I've been hurt by the world and I don't want to be hurt again.
Yes.
And there's truth to that, but what I think a lot of people don't talk about is a lot of people who've been through a lot of trauma who isolate themselves, it's not simply because they dislike people or they don't trust people. It's also because when you go out into a crowd, like if you go to a mall or some, ballpark or some busy place, you come home absolutely emotionally drained.
Absolutely. Yep.
And I thought most of my life, well, this is because I'm an introvert and I fill up when I'm alone. And I just thought it was
And
introversion.
it's so toxic to go among all these people. Holy crap.
Right. But
Yeah.
I'm coming to find out that when you've been through deep trauma, you have a lot of empathy and you can pick up very easily on other people's pain, even if they're not sharing it with you, even if it doesn't show on their face. And so when you go out into the world, which is filled with hurting, broken people, you sort of, without realizing it, kind of come home with a lot of that on your shoulders.
Sure.
And so I think that, a lot of these people that are going through this, they've got the trauma, they've got the empathy. They've also, a lot of them are very creative. They're artists. They are writers. They're deep thinkers. They're very connected to their own thoughts and emotions. They're very introspective and creative. And so I find that these three things are sort of the profile for the targets of the long-term sleep paralysis. And I think that, they're looking for the next Helena Blavatsky. They're looking for the next H.P. Lovecraft. They're looking for the next person where they can feed off of this person's creative energies and this person's gifts and these person's abilities to craft them as their own spokesperson, or to kind of make them their thrall, so to speak. And I think what's so sad about a lot of these people that get caught in this web, because it's very euphoric. You go up to the astral realm and your dopamine is just shooting off all over the place because you feel powerful, and they're telling you you're going to be like a god and you're going to have these powers, and we're giving you all this knowledge. So you have this euphoric sort of feeling that you get almost addicted to. But what's really going on in many cases is you're just a thrall for these. These entities can no longer come down to earth and interact, because they did that on Mount Hermon. They came down, they interacted with human beings. They were punished. They were thrown in the abyss. So now they've got to get us up there. So then it's very clever. If you come up here by your own free will, I can't get punished for coming down and destroying humanity again, so they're kind of trying to put the onus on us. Well, hey, you came up here, you asked,
Right. And people, and I want to point out that sometimes people don't understand. You know how that thing about the vampire that you got to invite them in?
Yes.
This is the same thing. You going there is equivalent to an invitation. Like you said, hey, you came up here, so I guess we're buds, right? We're good, man. Right?
You have
that's the way it works.
You've hit the nail so hard on the head that the nail has exploded, because my entire chapter 4 in the book, it's called something like Threshold Covenants and Astral Vampires. And that's the whole point of this chapter, that our modern concept of a vampire, again, it looks all fictional, but there's so much arcane knowledge in there. Like we don't really think, we just think in terms of like shadow people and old hags and alien grays and things. But if you go back into antiquity, these things had names. These were like the screech owl, like it says in Isaiah. It's the Lilith, the Lamia, the Lamashtu, the Lilu. These were nocturnal, incubus, succubus, seductive. And what's interesting is they do have to be given permission, and they do have to have an invitation. And this is the law of the entire spiritual realm, not just the astral, not just the evil. In Revelation 3:20, Jesus Christ says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come and eat with them and they with me. And so even Jesus Christ is waiting for that invitation. He's not going to barge in, because we learn in John 10 that if someone barges in through your front door, through your front gate, the sheep pen, if someone barges in, they're a thief. They're a robber.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's
so,
just something that's, how can I say it? It's in a metaphysical level, if you want to look at it.
Yes.
Where it's the agreement. It's the agreement.
Absolutely. 100%. Yes. And you'll notice, even like I always tell people, hey, here's a fun thing to do on a Saturday. do a Google image and type in shadow man, and
Oh.
it'll pick up all these, you'll get all these pictures, which obviously are mostly all drawings and artist renditions and paintings and things. 50% or more, and I'm being really generous there because it's a lot more than 50%. For some reason, most artists who want to draw the shadow man have him standing by a bedroom door.
All the time.
Yeah.
Or
So
at the foot of the bed. Somewhere in that vicinity, yeah.
Yep. So,
Yes.
and what happens here is this goes back to the threshold covenant. This goes back to the vampire, they cannot cross the threshold without permission. But here's where it gets tricky. A lot of people are like, well, I never said come in, but there are other ways of giving invitation to these, because they're tricksters, they're seductrists. We know, going all the way back to the garden, the serpent didn't fairly win that scuffle. He tricked them. He had to, he tricked them. And so the spirit realm, highly legalistic group of creatures, they know a whole bunch of things that have fallen out of our knowledge. And so they know how to easily lure us into giving them an invitation. And so they have all sorts of clever tricks. Sometimes they don't come as a scary shadow being or a red glowing eyed hat man. Sometimes they come as grandma or your mom who died or your son who died. And so you're come in, and how, you're easily welcoming them in because they put that flesh suit on. And our fear, and not just our fear, very strong emotion, whether it's fear, anger, or an eroticism, that is a magnet to these things. And so I always tell people, when there's 365 verses in scripture that tell us not to fear, don't be afraid. And I always tell people, this isn't just like God being like a cosmic therapist, like, no, don't worry about it, don't worry, be happy, right? This is him giving us a major key to keeping spiritual doors locked from being attacked or having demonic attachments, because fear is often the invitation. That's what draws them. And we see this all over. And I couldn't believe it. I just watched the Netflix children's movie Slumberland, which is...
I have not looked. I haven't seen it. To be honest with you, I don't subscribe to Netflix for my own reasons. More protests than ever. But I was reading an article about Slumberland.
Yes.
Just today.
Well,
but anyway, go ahead.
Oh my gosh, like they give everything away. They've got all the doors in there, all the doors that they're willingly walking through. You've got the nightmare in there, and the nightmare is attracted to fear. So you have to overcome your fear. You have to control your fear. And I could go off on a massively nerdy tangent.
A lot of symbology. Then
total symbology. The nightmare in Slumberland is, they call it the big black squid, but it really looks more like the mind flayer from season 1 of Stranger Things. It's this sort of like black tentacle. But if you go into the actual definition of a mind flayer, it's not like a spider or a squid. The actual mind flayer is a humanoid creature with an elongated squid or octopus head. So we're back to Cthulhu, and we're back to nautical.
I was going to say Thin Man, because every time I see something like that, I think of the Cthulhu, whether it's the up and up or version of like the octopus, squid, like you said, even spiderish kind of feel. I'm sure if you ever saw that movie Hellboy,
right, Hellboy, Arrival, they're little octopus, the aliens are octopus creatures. There's a Cthulhu looking guy in what's that cartoon? It's not the Simpsons one, but Futurama. There's the guy with like the squid head. So those, anytime you see a squid head alien or a Cthulhu, like that is the mind flayer. And this is someone who controls the mind. And, it's interesting. The mythology of the mind flayer is that they eat human brains. But metaphorically, if you are being transported against your will night after night into the astral realm, and you are being indoctrinated in their theosophical arcane knowledge and religions, and you are being primed to be a spokesperson or a teacher of this knowledge to bring back to earth, the fact is they have just ate your brain. They have taken over your mind. You no longer are a free thinker. And in fact, all of the mind flayers, that they're from the illithid class, that's what they're called in the fandom lores. The illithids, these squid head humanoids, they always have one or two thralls or slaves.
Okay.
So they have two human beings that are kind of mind controlled, that do all their bidding for them. And so when you know this arcane knowledge, then it's a whole different perspective. So in you don't listen to their lies when you're up there and they say, you're chosen. We brought you up here because you have special powers and you're special. You're like, no, you are training me to be a thrall. You're an illithid. You're a mind flayer.
Because they're not about to admit that, say, I have really no power in your dimension, in your plane.
Yeah.
I don't. Okay.
Yeah.
I need you to do what I can't do.
Yes.
All right. But they're not about to admit that, because you'd be like, oh, so you can't.
But wait a minute.
You can't operate here. Oh, wait a minute. Right? You're not such a great deity after, whatever. But people, which sometimes I think attest to not only what you said, which is an attachment, or in some cases an obsession or possession or whatever.
Yeah.
Or those people that have that momentary break with that do things that, and it's really weird, because sometimes, I'm not going to say all the time, they will, and sometimes it's just a good defense, but sometimes they will say, I cannot remember what I did. Like, the last couple of hours, 3, 4, whatever long, they can't remember.
Yes.
And it's like, it's basically like you said, they need you, or they need that person. In other words,
yeah, exactly.
Like that role, like you said, to do on this plane.
And they operate through flattery, and like you were saying earlier, they know our weaknesses and our desires, and they're more than willing to portend as though they are going to fulfill those things for you. They'll use you as long as they need you, and eventually, once they have gotten from you what they need, you'll be expendable. But then there's the people that say, well, what about these people that are into this for like 20, 30, 40 years? And it's like, because if they're the thrall, like if they're the thrall, then they're not going to be expended, because they are, doing the bidding of this thing that needs a slave, and so for some people, they can carry on in this lifestyle for decades and not ever find their way out of the labyrinth, to understand that they're being used as dupes. And
or we could go down, and I'm going to do a little segue here. I'm sure you've seen this big thing with Balenciaga and the BDSM.
Yes.
Okay. Bondage, S&M, who's the master, who's the slave.
Yes.
Some people difficult as people, and some level subconsciously or whatever, if they feel their soul being the slave.
Yes.
That you just say, who would willingly submit to this? It's because there's something that's being fed in your soul to be the slave.
Yes.
And sometimes, like you were saying, how sometimes we see things in front of us.
Yeah.
And there's a deeper meaning behind it.
Yeah.
Some people could look at this latest scandal with Balenciaga and the children and the BDSM and all this, the symbol, like, hello, it's not even a symbol. It's right there in your face.
Yes.
But perhaps there is a deeper meaning behind that, as in whoever thought of this, promotes this, what is their soul talking about? Because that doesn't come from your head. You think it would, comes from the person's soul.
Yeah. Yeah.
When they come up with that imagery, how's that?
Yeah. Yep.
And like what you were saying, who would want to? Because if you ask somebody logically to be a slave, they'd be like, hell no, I would never want to do that. Are you crazy?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And not only physically, we're talking here mentally, spiritually, emotionally.
Yes.
Profound.
That is
most
profound.
people would say no.
Yeah.
And it speaks to a wider audience.
Yeah.
But keep going, because this is so interesting as far as what you were talking about.
That is profound, Marlene. And that makes so much sense to me, because I come at it from my own head. Like, I don't want to be some, entity's thrall. But you're so right. Like, to some people, it's a turn on to them to be on the bottom, And so,
Yes. Yes.
what's interesting to me about that is it really brings to my mind, there's a lot of metaphorical imagery in the Old and New Testament about slavery as well. And when you look at the Israelites, well, I suppose they were the Hebrews at the time, the Hebrews that were enslaved for 400 years in Egypt, they were in bondage. And when they were brought out into the wilderness, the metaphorical jargon, as they were coming into freedom and as they were, had the Torah revealed to them and whatever, it God wasn't telling them, okay, you're no longer slaves. What he was saying to them was, you're no longer in bondage to a taskmaster who's going to beat you and destroy your livelihood and make you feel like you're in prison. You're now in bondage to a taskmaster who loves you and is going to protect you and take care of you. But they're still, in a sense, in a slave relationship. And Paul even talks in this language. They take it out of the modern context because we wouldn't stand for it. But Paul always calls himself a servant of Christ. In some translations, you get a little bit more to what that word really means. It says that he's a bond servant to Christ.
Right.
If you go to the Greek, the doulos, the word actually means slave. And in some of the older translations, it does say, I'm a slave to Christ. And now there's so many, modern American connotations to that. Let's leave that out. But what's interesting to me about what you just said is, yes, the ultimate goal for our souls isn't to wriggle free and make sure that we are not a slave to anyone or anything. We're our own God. That actually gets us into trouble as well. And we see that in the ascension doctrine, and we see that in the Christ consciousness, and theosis is what they called it, in previous centuries, and in Eastern religions and things. The deal is that ultimately we can become our own God, and so it's almost like our flesh always believes that freedom means we have our own autonomy. We answer to no one. But where the truth really is that you've got two options. You can be a slave to this kingdom, or you can be a slave to this kingdom. And which kingdom do you ultimately want to be a servant in, right?
Well, it depends. I'm gonna tell you briefly what I think.
Sure.
When somebody says they're a slave, they're abdicating responsibility for their actions. Okay, you're a slave. Hey, that thing, I followed orders.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
True. Yes.
Whereas non-slavery means, yes, you're free, but you're responsible for yourself, for your
Absolutely.
actions.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And that's why it's so easy sometimes to fall into that role of servitude, whatever it is.
Yes.
Okay.
I hear what you're saying.
Because you can back out and say, hey, okay, you're gonna even protect me, whatever. A lot of people make that deal with the devil kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
In exchange for, because the other side of that is no one to tell you, but you are responsible.
Yeah.
The good and the bad.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is the thing. Personally, if I stood before God, he I don't come to you out of fear of punishment or expecting rewards. You understand? Because really, that's really what counts, is like that you come out of your own free will.
Yeah.
Good and bad, because I think that's kind of the neat thing about being a human being on this plane.
Yeah.
But the truth is that servitude role, like you were saying, the wording that they use, maybe it sounds pious if you want to look at it, because if you're saying I'm the servant or the slave of the God, of Jesus, of whatever, that sounds very pious, but it infers other things as well, which is self-responsibility. But anyway, let me get off my
No, I love
Go
that,
ahead.
Marlene. I love that, Marlene, because I certainly agree with you that we can come up with whatever philosophy or worldview or
Mhm.
religion that we want. And we can say things like, well, I was absolutely born this way, or, well, there
Right.
is no God. And what's really behind a lot of these mantras is, if what I just said is true, then I'm not responsible for any of the decisions I make. You can't hold me
Right.
accountable. If I was born this way, you can't hold me accountable. And
Right.
if there is no God, then you can't hold me accountable. And I do agree with that. And the good news about the gospel of the kingdom is, when you take on that role as servant, as you get deeper into what the gospel message really is, what happens, and we see this in the Semitic culture, when it talked about slavery in the Old Testament, it wasn't talking about the American version.
Right.
What they would do is they would take on their own people as servants, as a way of paying back debts, and then they would earn their
Mhm.
freedom back, and it was a different
Right.
sort of a thing. And what could happen in the Semitic culture of servitude, if you were a good servant, when your debt was paid and your time was up,
Right.
you could be adopted by the head of the household as a full-blooded heir of the house and be in the
Sure.
will and everything. And that is the servitude that Paul and the gospel is talking about. It's not American slavery, it's this Semitic slavery where,
Mhm.
well done, good and faithful servant. That's the line that the believers get on judgment day in heaven. Well done, good and faithful servant, enter into joy today. And what that means is, this is the moment of um, your your freedom from slavery, and I'm adopting you as a full-blooded son, and you're receiving all of the inheritance.
Right, because back then it was, and and I'm sure you've heard that even though during colonial periods, well, it wasn't only in the United States, I want to say all over the world, there was what they called indentured servants.
Yes, yeah,
Okay, and yes, some people, it was they were basically indentured because of, you committed a crime, and instead of, imprisoning you, we're going to send you off and let you perish in the wilderness. But some people actually indentured themselves as a way to get out, let's say to the United States back then, to the colonies. You didn't have
yes,
money, you had no way, and you basically signed an agreement for X amount of years, but this was done willingly.
yeah,
Okay,
yes,
because maybe where you were coming from, whatever circumstances, and sometimes those agreements worked out well, sometimes not so well, but there was times where people, and like you said, sometimes even the indentured servant stayed on with that family,
yes,
all right, and became part of the family, or even prospered once they're certain they were done, with the agreement, with whether it was 5 years or 7 years, whatever the case might be.
yeah,
It's not always a question of being done like against your will, but
yes.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And this kind of goes all the way back to earlier when I was talking about how, when we lose sight of the culture, the context, the language, the history, the geography of a text. And this is a good example. The language, the linguistics, the etymology. Like,
yes,
we have, when we hear the word slave, that is a loaded term for an
yeah,
American. And that is
hmm,
something that we really want distance from. But obviously, when they were writing about this 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, Moses, Paul, they had no concept of our American 21st century
no,
definition
no,
of that. So this is where it gets really complicated, and where things can get pulled out of context. And quite
sure,
frankly, where God and Jesus can look like real jerks, because it looks like they're advocating these things. And
yeah,
they, of course,
hmm.
absolutely were not. But um, so, lest the listeners think, Marlene, that we're way off track of sleep paralysis,
Yeah,
we,
it's like
we really are not, because
no,
what I talk about in the book is the dark weapon of sleep paralysis is really everything we've been talking about. It is a flaying of the mind. It
hmm,
is a trying to dupe us into not remembering who we really are. This comes across very strongly in the Slumberland movie as well. Flip, her little spirit guide, who well, I don't want to spoil it for people to see it.
yeah,
He keeps saying that he's been stuck in dreamland for so long he can't remember who he is. He can't wake up until he
yes,
remembers who he is. And that really is a mind flaying. He has forgotten his own name, his own individuality. And we see hints of this even in Lord of the Rings, where when Frodo calls Gollum Smeagol, and he is overwhelmed at the remembrance of his name, because that was his identity. That was his core. That was who he really was. That was who he was meant to be. And there is a point where when we keep going up into the astral realm and we keep messing with these things, and we keep being, if you've got beings in the spirit realm telling you who you are, you're a chosen one, you're special, you're, this, you're that, we truly do lose touch with our identity. And if you get into the realms now of like singularity or the transhuman movement and all this stuff, they really are. It's not just some metaphorical, like, we lose touch with who we are. They literally want us to morph into the image of the false God. Not, we were created in the image of God, and they want that changed. And part of this whole astral endeavor is to get us to willingly and joyfully deny whose image we bear and take on their image instead.
Sure. And what they're asking is for us to sacrifice our humanity, which is what makes us unique. It is what makes us unique.
It is.
And it's so funny because I'm sure you've seen that show from Star Trek, Jean-Luc Picard, with the Borg. I mean, it's become like a cult classic.
Gosh. Oh, yes, the Borg.
When that came out, it was strictly sci-fi. It was like, what a great show, what a great episode, the Borg. And now it's like, who channeled that? Who was the creator? Who was the writer of that episode?
Right.
Okay, who was foreseeing, maybe not channeling, or maybe that eventually that's that saying, all roads lead to Rome. Well, this is where this road will lead to, that you described, where they want us to be, where because let's face it, our humanity is what makes us want to be individuals and not have anybody read our thoughts.
Yeah, I know, right?
Our emotions. It's like, hey,
kidding.
And as an introvert, you know what I'm talking about, right?
I do.
So
get out of my head.
Can you imagine that you would be so connected at all times, 24/7, whether you were physically apart, but really what counts is up here, that you would be connected and somebody could monitor your feelings, your thoughts, your actions.
Yeah.
That's a nightmare. And let me tell you, to me, that would be like hell. That right there is horrible.
And they don't want to just passively sit back and eavesdrop. They want to interact and influence our actions as well. And it's so great that you mentioned the Borg, the hive mind, because the Borg is the hive mind. So guess what? The mind flayers, the Illithids, their god, their ruler is called the elder brain. And every time an Illithid dies, a mind flayer dies, their brain is fed to the elder brain. So the elder brain is the collective brain of every Illithid or every mind flayer that passed on, that died. So it's this hive mind. Literally, it's a huge brain that feeds off of the brains of its dead, and this is the guy that rules the whole Illithid kingdom. And so there's so much being given away, even in our fandoms and metaverse stuff and in the comic books. And they are giving away so much stuff that just seems like fun, innocent entertainment.
Right. Yeah. Entertainment.
And it's like, no, they are priming us to receive eventually in some generation, when they launch this all on us, we're going to be prepped and ready for it, because what was really scary to us at one point is going to be cool to us. I mean, I don't know if you remember this. When I was a kid, I saw the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers movie.
Yes.
Wasn't the original, but it was the one put out in the 70s.
Right.
And I remember in the back seat of the car driving home, I mean, because I was young, and I remember in my own little head thinking, that was so scary of a thought. I'm so glad it was just a movie. And now it's like, oh no, right?
Well,
it's not even scary anymore. You watch it and you're like, yeah, that's happening.
You know what? The other day, as a matter of fact, a couple of days ago, you know, the original RoboCop, they
Yeah.
made they did a remake like in 2014. I had never seen it, and I
Okay.
saw it the other day, and it was the same premise. But if you look at it, basically the premise is, you know, he, yeah, he's human, but not really, because
Mm,
they can turn him on and off, and he's connected to that machine. All
yeah.
right. Basically, he's hooked up in such a way that if they want to, they turn a switch, and
Yeah.
he just falls down.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And I was looking at that and I was like, you know what? I didn't see it that way when I saw the original
I
RoboCop back in the
know.
80s. It was
I
a great sci-fi
know.
story.
I know.
Uh, but I looked at that and it's like when you see, like, what is it? When you have the eyes to see, it was like,
Yes.
man, wow. that's I know it's a remake, but basically because you know, you see that push towards the, what you want to call it, the melding of robotics with
Yes.
humans.
Transhuman. Yeah.
Transhumanism, okay, how can I say it? I understand the advantages of it. Let's say for somebody that, let's say you've seen people that have lost their limbs,
Sure.
that
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but that's different. That's
That
different.
is, we're not talking about robotics. We're talking
We're not
about,
we're talking, well, you know, prosthetics, but even,
yes.
you know, I'm not against that.
No.
But when you start talking about they're trying to do something with your brain,
Yeah. Yep.
then that
Yep.
becomes that's becomes, and my concern is sometimes, I'm sure you've heard it, that a lot of these things are introduced as we want to help,
Yes.
these people
Yep.
that have these illnesses or have suffered these horrible accidents.
Yep.
That's how they introduce it, and so of course
Yeah.
everybody's, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But then it's like almost like that invitation you said, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And what comes after that is, I think that, like you said, and unfortunately, I think in our times where we have this instant gratification kind of programming,
Yeah.
that it's hard for us to conceive that plans can be made 20, 30, or 40 or 50 years into the future as far as
Yes.
for results.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know,
When
we kind of don't get it. I know.
we don't. And when you're dealing with immortal entities, they've got all the time in the world. And
Sure.
especially if they're living outside time, I don't know
Yeah.
dimensionally if I don't I don't know that the astral realm is bound to time. I don't think it is, but
Hmm.
regardless, these people aren't looking at it like, oh crap, this is going to take 50 years for this to take root.
Right.
They got, they got all the time in the world, and they've got patience. They're not human. They're not thinking the way we do.
Do you see them? Because I've heard a theory. Do you think that they are what we would call interdimensional ETs?
So I think that there is many different forms and beings. I don't think this is another kind of downfall, I think, of the dumbing down of the biblical education in the church, and that is, many Christians, when they sense or feel or see or experience anything dark or unusual or paranormal, everything's a demon. It's a demon. It's a demon. It's
Oh
a
God,
demon.
yes, I know
And
exactly.
and it's like, okay, theologically, a demon is one very specific class of being. And
Hmm.
so every single thing, I mean, we even see in Ephesians 6:12, there are 4 different types of beings are mentioned in Ephesians 6:12, and demons aren't even mentioned. There's rulers, authorities, and then spiritual forces of wickedness. And there's another one that I always get mixed up because different translations use the same, different words for archons and rulers, authorities, principalities, things
Right.
like that. And so I do think that most of what we see here on Earth, like the little paranormal and the ghosty things, I think that, a lot of what we interact with here on Earth is probably more of a demonic thing, because they are these, they are somewhat earthbound because they are
Hmm.
half human. They're the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, which were demigods. They had angelic fathers and human mothers, so they're bound to Earth. So this is their
Okay.
playground. But once you get up into the astral, you're on their turf. So now you're in Ephesians 6:12 territory. You're in the high places of Ephesians 6:12. So now you're potentially not only have the rulers, the archons, the authorities, the principalities, but you've also got ascended masters and spirit guides and new agers
Right.
and practitioners of the occult and other human beings who are dabbling in this. And so there's
Yeah.
all sorts of things up there. And it's interesting to me, these alien grays or the little green men. There are many occasions where these beings show up in a sleep paralysis scenario where
Yes.
people are waking up in their bedrooms. But a lot of times we also see them where people are having abductee experiences out in the middle of the cornfield and as they're driving their car down the road. And so this
Right.
is a very unique being because I wouldn't classify it with the Lilia, Lilith Lamashtu vampiric nocturnal incubus succubus type of creatures. But it seems that they also sometimes rather interfere or use the sleep paralysis as their vehicle. And there's people out there who unequivocally say the alien grays are demons. And again,
Right.
I'm not sure about that because I'm not sure about that. I've heard a lot of theories.
Right.
And and the UFO experiences aren't my main field because I look at, there's people out there, like the LA Marzullis that I'm like, yay, there's already an expert out there doing this, but I've heard people talk about how the grays are kind of like the thralls. They're the slave class.
Yeah.
They're there to kind of do the dirty work. They're very low on the totem pole. But what's interesting is I actually think that a lot of the beings that we're seeing in sleep paralysis are very low on the totem pole because the demons, the incubus, the succubus, anything that is potentially demigod, anything that is potentially half human or part human, anything that shares like in human genetics, I think they are going to rank very low on an angelic or spiritual hierarchy because they're not pure blooded. And if you even go back, I reference this in my book, if you go all the way back to and like angel dictionaries and stuff that were written centuries ago, they rank the incubus and the succubus as the absolute like bottom of the totem pole of all angelic beings, because they're mixed with these filthy human beings and these spiritual beings, which is why I think it's so funny when you read stuff about, when you go to the astral plane, these angelic beings, they admire us and they're so fascinated with us and they think we're so great. And it's like, that couldn't be further from the truth. They actually despise us. And there's even, I think it's in the book of Enoch. Enoch is brought up into the third heaven, and the angels, like the good angels, like not fallen angels, the good angels are like, who let this guy in? He stinks. I love that passage. We are like, we're the worms. Like we are like in their estimation, which is why the spirit realm is so dead set on attacking us and making us fail and tricking us into these contracts and these soul selling situations, because they cannot believe that the inheritance of the kingdom is going to the lowest of the low. Like they cannot believe that their inheritance has been passed over and given to the filthy human race.
Well, and I'm sure everybody's let's use Hollywood as an example, so because everybody kind of gets the idea. Like that movie Prophecy, the one with I think that's a great movie, by the way. Because it took such a weird approach to the angel thing.
Yeah.
Because this was around the time when that movie came out, there was a surge of angelic stuff.
Yes.
And it was all very pink and beautiful, and the angels, don't get me wrong, I like that. I have no problem, but it took a totally opposite approach as far as the relationship between humans and angels.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where not everybody was on our side, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and even the good angels, there's cryptic little hints in the scriptures as to how the good angels think of human beings. And there's things like they marvel at humans because they're able to look into things that they were never able to look into. And like the mystery of the gospel, when Jesus came and started revealing things on earth, he was revealing things to man that the angels didn't even know. And they marveled that we were able to look into things that even they weren't allowed to look into. And then there's these references in scripture that we're only a little lower than the angels, which, you know, when I look at all of these people that are striving to be something special, something chosen, and they go to all of these hoops to meditate and astral project and sell their soul, so to speak, when according to scripture, we're only a little bit lower than those things to begin with. And once we come into glory in our resurrected body, we will be heirs. We'll be more than like we're getting offered more. It's one of these age-old situations. You can have the world if you just wait for the right timing, or you can have everything now, but it'll elude you. You know, there's even a great line in the movie Inception about this, where the Leonardo DiCaprio character is stuck in limbo for 50 years. And he's asked like, oh, wasn't that wonderful, or something to that effect. And he says, oh, it was wonderful at first being up there, believing that we were gods. And, but he in essence says, but it all fell short because in essence, we knew it wasn't real. And right. There's a lot being given away in that line. When you're in the astral realm, you are treated as a god, and you're told that you will one day achieve that. And, you know, that promise was held out to Adam and Eve, and they both died. They did not become gods. And so I'm thinking, if the serpent couldn't fulfill that promise the first time, he's probably not willing or able to fulfill it for any of us either.
Well, you know, it all depends, again, you know, what feeds your soul. And I guess it's, what is it? It's not what you want, it's what you need. Sometimes I think that, whether you want to call it temptation, or it's kind of like that comes with being here on this plane.
Yeah.
Whether you succumb or you resist.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
You're supposed to do that's what you're supposed to be doing here, working it out.
Yeah.
You know, as far as and you know, you'll get people that say, well, I was tempted. But and just because you're tempted doesn't mean you did it. You know,
yeah,
you can get tempted all you want, but you know, that's what comes with it. But I think, and I'm gonna really quickly, because before it slips away from me, when you said something about that to these beings, whatever you want to call them, the time is not the same as for us, if time does exist for them. Okay, the only time I would say that they run into a problem is if they have brought in, like, and I'm going to use your word, a thrall.
Okay, yes.
Which has become very powerful. But let's face it, thrall or not, powerful or not, they all die.
You're going to die. You're going to have to train a new guy in.
Where they are racing against time. If this person has some type of power, whether it's through their position in a government, through their money, through whatever field, where they are fighting time. Okay. To have this person do whatever it is that they want, that they can, how can I say, they can either complete or put something in motion.
Yes.
That they can't do for themselves. That's the only time I would say that they're hindered by having humans to do their bidding.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise, you know, it's like, oh my God, we're gonna have to start all over again.
I know. That's such a great point. Yeah. And I think that they're keenly aware of time, because there's a very fascinating verse in the New Testament that says that the devil becomes enraged because he knows his time is short. So, and the devil, you know, if he is, you know, Satan, it's such a misunderstood concept. Satan is just the Hebrew word for adversary. It's just a common noun. It's not a personal name, or there's not some guy named Satan. And in fact, there are probably many, many, many Hasatans, you know, the adversary. And I think that's another thing too, that we really have this kind of Star Wars interpretation of good and evil, where there's one bad guy and one good guy. and they do a sword fight, and one of them wins at the end. And so we think like, okay, there's this guy in a red suit and a guy with a long beard, and they have a little lightsaber fight at the end, and God wins.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be more like that scene in Indiana Jones where he turns around with his, gun or his knife or whatever to fight the one swordsman, and then hundreds of other ones show up, and he has to do this swashbuckling dance routine to kill all of them. And I do think that it's going to be a massively unfair fight. I don't think at the end, when Jesus comes back on the white horse with the flaming sword, prepared for battle, he's not coming back as a hippie. He's not coming back with the man bun and the sandals. He's coming back as a warrior. He's coming back in full battle gear with a sword strapped to his side. And he's not going to just go and meet some devil guy that looks like Anton LaVey out on the battlefield and they have a little sword fight. I think he's going to show up on that battlefield, and there will be thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, the adversaries, Hasatans there to war with him. And so I think this whole idea of like Satan is like this one guy.
So because it's been personified that way as, like you said, that one universal bad guy, the villain.
Yes. Yeah,
whether you want to call it Lucifer or the devil or whatever.
Yeah.
Let me ask you: do you think that in like Islam that they describe what they call the jinn?
Yes.
Do you think that it's just the same thing but with a different name because it's a different culture, or are we talking different types of beings?
I think it's the same concept. And one of the really fun parts that I researched that's in the book is I kind of go around the world and I show briefly how every culture views sleep paralysis and what they call it and what they think causes it or what they think shuns it away. And it's just fascinating. And there are hundreds of different interpretations of this. I mean, we're all seeing it as the same thing, but we're calling it different things. And I do believe that in the Muslim cultures, they do call it the jinn. There's an Asian culture that calls it, they call the sleep paralysis experience pressed down by the black, which I thought that one was pretty cool. So, there's all sorts of different cultural interpretations. And, this is one of those like sketchy things that where some people, their logic is, well, if every single culture has a understanding of this, then it must be cultural lore. It must be mythology. It must be. But then there's another school of logic that would be, if this is something that's collective to all of humankind, maybe there's something to it.
Exactly. It's just sometimes it's a little bit because it goes through the lens of the culture, whatever it is.
Yes.
But yes, that common denominator is there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where it's seen not as something physical, but something on a spiritual level.
Yeah.
That happens to the person when they experience it.
Yep. And if it's a little bit different, we're very different culturally. We have different experiences and different belief systems. And I think the way in the past, though it's changing now, the way that these entities have had to deal with Americans over the last 50 years, they've had to be somewhat covert because we've been a very stoic sort of postmodern, show me, I need proof, believe it, scientific method. But now I think that we are opening up more spiritually here. And we have such an appetite now for the supernatural and the paranormal with our media and everything. So I think that things will become more overt in America as well. But in other countries where they 100% openly believe in this stuff, a lot of their sleep paralysis experiences are far more overt and mind-blowing than they would be here because these entities are able to appear in the context that the culture is willing to receive them. And I'll give you a really quick example. In Western Africa, I had a guy write to me shortly after the book got published from Western Africa. And he said, in Western Africa, we teach our children to never receive a gift from a stranger. If a stranger comes up to you on the street and offers you an apple or a piece of candy, and what this goes back to is the child would receive the gift. And then later that same day or within a few days, they would have a nightmare or a sleep paralysis experience. And a very scary entity would reveal itself and say, "You owe me for that apple, give it back." And they'd say, "Well, I can't, I ate it." And then they'd say, "Well, then you have to pay me for it." "Well, I can't, I don't have that money." And so once this child is backed into a corner of terror, thinking that he and his whole family are going to be killed if he doesn't pay him back for this apple, then he is offered a very generous compromise, and he's given this wager.
Yes.
I will forgive the debt of this apple, and you're going to love this because you brought it up earlier. I'll forgive the debt if you give me permission to live in your home. And now they have access to the entire home. They were given invitation through trickery and seduction.
Right.
And so this kind of stuff happens in West Africa. That isn't going to happen in the United States of America, because we're not open to that spiritually. No. And so just because a sleep paralysis experience differs from culture to culture doesn't mean that everyone is contradicting one another. It's that we're all seeing the world through the lenses of our own worldview and traditions and culture and history and language, etc.
Well, there's and I don't know if you've heard of this tradition, and I'm Hispanic, and in the Caribbean, I want to say the islands and everything, there is where they say that if you hear, let's say, someone knock at your door 3 times when you're not expecting anybody, how's that?
Yeah.
But it's the 3-time knock that you should not open the door. Based along the same lines of what you just described.
Yes.
You will hear people that will say, well, they opened the door and nobody's there.
Yes.
But it's just, you're not seeing what's there.
Yes.
So basically, by you answering the knock on the door, you're allowing this spirit to come into the house.
Yes.
All right.
And that falls perfectly in line
there.
That falls in line with the lore of the black-eyed children.
Yes,
they come to the door and they're like, "Can I use your phone? Can I have a glass of water?" All they want to do is get over that threshold.
Yes. And that is and that's why there's a lot of times that they'll say, if you hear that 3 knock, and it's especially if you're not expecting, do not open the door. Do not open the door.
Wow.
And most people would say, well, but it's like, don't open the door. Especially if your Ring camera shows there's nobody out inside of your door.
Yeah, right.
Whoever it was. But yes. And this is the thing. Sometimes, you hear of a lot of cultures that they have what they call ancestor worship.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. But if you really, not all the time, and I'm not going to say I'm an expert in that, but a lot of the times this, even among the Asian, different Asians, that they, even when they because recently we went through, after Halloween, that there was a Day of the Dead and All Saints Day and everything.
Yep.
Where they even put things out for ghosts, where they call hungry ghosts.
Yep.
That don't have a family. A lot of that, though, if you look at it, it's not so much ancestor worship as ancestor appeasement. Right? You don't appease something unless you fear it.
Yes.
Okay, because otherwise you wouldn't have to appease it.
Yes.
Okay. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't see anything wrong in the sense that if as a family you don't honor or you don't do certain things for your ancestors, or whether they're recent, you don't do certain things, they're going to get mad at you. Okay. That's like a weird thing, because again, you should not need to appease. How can I say it? One thing is, let's say people, even here in Western culture, they'll visit a grave and they'll put flowers on the. That's different. I'm not talking about that.
Yeah.
I'm talking where there's certain things that you need to do on a certain day, and in some cases, you'll even have places where they even have altars and everything for the ancestor worship, and you better do that, whatever it is, because if not, if your great grandfather or granduncle gets mad, you're in trouble. You're in doo-doo, and they're not going to protect the family.
Yes.
All right. And you're treading a fine line there as far as who are you appeasing, really? Is it or is it something else? Because again, that's, I think, sometimes where spiritual beliefs, maybe their basis was on something else. And then you'll have other cultures where after somebody dies, you're not allowed to say that person's name for fear that you will draw them back.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. In other words, not you, nobody. Like everybody acts like so and so, like, you know how we go through the grieving process and we have a wake and all this. There's places
Yeah.
that once that person dies for an X amount of time,
Yeah.
nobody is allowed to talk or say that person's name,
Wow. Wow.
because the fear is that if you start calling that person's name or start talking about them,
Yeah.
you're going to pull them back in. And of course, and it, it takes on, other
Yeah.
things. But
Call up
yeah, there's right. Exactly.
call up the
So
familiar.
do you think that then what you're saying is that through the sleep paralysis, basically it's like a portal that
Yes.
these beings have into reaching into you and then start.
Yeah, yep. I think it, historically you always had to be in a some sort of state of an altered state of consciousness.
Mhm.
This is why,
Right.
a lot of them, this is where the concept of pharmakia comes in, our
Yes.
our word for pharmacy, but obviously the Greek word means sorcery, because in the old days you could not perform sorcery unless you were in this altered state of consciousness, because that
Right.
was the portal to the spirit realm. And so that's why sleep paralysis is such an ideal time, because you're in altered states of consciousness several times in and out of the night as you're drifting in and out of sleep stages. I think that that's going to change in the future. I think it's already changing. I think that the veil is getting thinner as we
Yes.
are inviting, talk about invitation into our own home. How about a country inviting these things into the entire country through rebellion and through invitation, and whatnot. So what's happening now, I think, is that they're not necessarily going to even need, at some point they're not even going to need us to be in an altered state of consciousness to communicate with us, because they're going to alter aspects of our brain technologically and physiologically, so that those switches that are on in our brain when we're in an altered state will always be flipped on. And they can already recreate a lot of this stuff in an operating room. There there are regions of the brain where if you probe it, the patient will see shadow men walking around in the room.
Right.
And there are medications like such as succinylcholine, which is used as a muscle relaxant when you're intubating a patient. And if you were to get a shot of succinylcholine without being sedated first, it mimics the whole sleep paralysis experience of you can't move, you feel like you can't
I've
breathe, you
heard that
feel like,
that's got to be horrible.
yeah. So I talk about that a little bit in the book as well. And so medically, physiologically, technologically, they can recreate a lot of these. We know now through voice to skull technology and
Mhm.
a lot of these things. And this is why a lot of people are going to think they're going crazy. They're going to think they've got schizophrenia. They're going to think that they're
Yeah,
communicating with
that's
these.
a typical question. Do you hear voices?
Yeah.
One of the
Yep.
questions people they've asked with people that that are mentally ill, psychotic and stuff. And it's like, yeah,
Absolutely.
but
Absolutely.
what do
And
you think is going to happen with all this use of ayahuasca and the mushrooms and stuff? Sometimes I hear people and I'm like dabbling in that. I'm like, I don't know, but I don't think that's such a good idea.
yeah, gosh, I don't either. I oh, I mean,
I don't know.
I understand that that we all as human beings, we are searching for meaning and purpose,
Hmm.
and I get why people are doing it, but I think what people don't understand, even with things like some of these new age practices like Reiki and myofascial
Hmm.
release and yoga and meditation. And, there's a
Right.
biblical meditation. It's much different than Eastern meditation. But with these things where you're putting yourself into an altered state of consciousness, or you're doing things that are making physiological changes in your body that are affecting chakras and uncoiling life force energies and third eye stuff. When you're doing that kind of stuff, and this is where it gets difficult, because there's people that say, well, this stuff has really relieved my pain and this has really
Right.
helped me. And the fact of the matter is, it's not that this stuff doesn't work. It's
Hmm.
that you're never going to connect that the demonic activity in your life, or the paranormal activity, or the night terrors, you're not ever going to connect that the things that opened those doors are, the these other activities. Like, because people aren't going to say the direct consequence of, myofascial release is that now I'm having sleep paralysis. I mean, people don't make that connection. And yet it's interesting in the letters that I get from people who are suffering, this just came out of nowhere. I've never had sleep paralysis in my whole life. And now it just came out of nowhere. And so, we'll go through a bunch of things and we'll talk about different things. We'll try to troubleshoot. And then I teach them how, like, this is how you can pray and ask, the God to just supernaturally reveal to you the source of this. And in 4 months, I've had 2 women come back to me. And a guy. There's been 3 where it came through a very innocent, where they were getting physical therapy or a massage or myofascial release. And in all 3 cases, they were like, it was a Christian practice. It was a born again Christian. And the fact is that a lot of this stuff that's coming into medicine, coming into even naturopathy, coming into health and fitness, coming into physical fitness, again, because we're separated from the arcane knowledge, because we're not being taught in the churches, the culture, the language, the context, the history, and the geography of the text, we have lost touch with the foundations. So a lot of these things are coming into the church, coming into theology, coming into all of these things. And a lot of us unwittingly are practicing Eastern religions, and we don't even know it, because we're just doing these innocent little things and we don't understand the origins.
Well, one of the times, because I've studied Reiki, and one of the things that, that I came across that basically, let's say, and I'm going to use Reiki as an example, but you could apply it also to what you were talking about. Basically, the practitioner is a filter. And if your Reiki practitioner is not as all put together as they appear, all right?
Yeah.
Basically, you're filtering that, whatever you want to, if you think you're getting healing power or whatever you're using the Reiki for, sometimes that's why you, like you described, you will have people that will go to Reiki or something like that.
Yeah.
They sometimes have these side effects that they're like, what? Where did this come from?
Yeah.
And it's because basically that human, that filter, because basically that's what they are.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
They're putting into you whatever is a part of them. All right.
Yeah.
And it's you have to be really, really careful. And even if it's in a non-spiritual or like you said, even physical rehab, I don't know. Have you ever heard of that, where they say that, whatever the cook is feeling or doing, it translates into the dish that they're
food.
cooking.
Yeah.
I think, that applies, across the board.
Yeah.
Where, like you said, the guy that's giving you rehab, you have no idea what's going on in this person's personal life.
Right.
All right.
Right.
They might be all together because they're at work, but you don't know what kind of person they are to begin with. Or maybe there's something going on that in that, whether the physical rehab or the massage or whatever, you will get it, especially if your defenses are a little bit low or a little bit open to it. I hate to say it, like attracts like.
Yes.
And people have to be careful, because like you said, you could be going to some place, either massage or rehab, with no idea of spiritual, whatever, if you want to call it contamination, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give you one of the examples that I've come across personally, and people have told me about. All right. People that have put down boundaries as far as blessings or barriers, if you want to call them a salt blessing, which, by the way, in the Catholic religion, even whatever, people don't realize, even what you use in an exorcism, whether it's the water, the salt, has to be blessed and exorcised. Okay. In other words, even what you're going to use. But anyway, of people doing that, let's say in their home, whether you want to call it a house blessing themselves, and all of a sudden they have either certain friends or families that don't want to come over anymore, or feel really uncomfortable.
Wow.
Because basically when you do that, you're not permitting evil, or even if it's not evil, sometimes I don't want to get all Hollywood on it, but negativity, whatever.
Yeah.
Even if whatever that person either carries or walks with them, they might not be aware of it, but they will have an aversion to coming to your home. Okay. This is when you will have people that will, and normally that they were supposed to come and spend the day with you. Half an hour later, we got to go. And from then on, they'll go, oh, well, let's meet. We'll meet at the restaurant. Or I've had instances of people that have done it. They've had workmen that have been working, and all of a sudden the workmen disappear. They don't want to come back. It becomes like and it's like, man, what was the point of origin? The point of origin was after they sealed their location, whether it's their property or the actual home, as far as against negativity and evil or anything that like that. It works. In other words, everybody thinks of it as only being on a spiritual entry, but if you've got something that walks with that person, whether it's spiritual turbulence or an attachment or whatever, it will not permit them to go there. Wow. Or it will want to get out of Dodge like right away. Like, and the person there's like, I don't get it. What happened? It's like, oh yeah, because of what you did. Yeah. It sometimes just people don't put two and two together as how that works.
No, they don't. The threshold, I write about it a lot in the book, and I've done some virtual conferences and things and a lot of my talks will focus on the threshold and how in antiquity, when we were an agrarian society, there were no cities, like, and our whole life was at home, living in our cave or our tent. The threshold was the hearthstone. Yes. It was the hearth, and this was the altar of the home. There was no temples or churches or synagogues back then, and so the house father was the priest of the home, and that fire was not only where fellowship and hospitality rituals and food and warmth, and that's where the family gathered. So it was this central meeting place, but it was also the altar. So that's where their sacrifices were made and the animals were slaughtered and the blood was poured. And so this is another example of where these entities can catch us on legalities by tricking us, because we don't understand anymore, and we don't put any importance anymore on the threshold of our home or the threshold of our bedroom.
Right.
But they are still that threshold into our home is still the altar of the home. And if we are not securing those thresholds, we're not paying any mind to who we're letting come in and out of the home. We might not think it matters anymore, but the entities who are ageless, they do know, and they're banking on our not knowing, and that's how many of them get access.
Well, that's why you would have even pre-Judeo-Christian and Roman times and everything, where they would sometimes even sacrifice a slave under a new structure, either in appeasement, or sometimes that spirit would be the guardian. In other words, you're going to be a slave in the afterlife for us. Okay. Like, because of what you said, because the entryway usually was the point, in other words, the person or the families or whatever understood that it wasn't just the human visitors. That you always had to safeguard against a spiritual visitor. And then and I'm sure you've seen, you get that, symbology, even things that are sigils or anything that's drawn also. Was a way like a safeguard.
Correct. The protection. This concept that the cornerstone of many buildings were actually built on top of human blood or a human sacrifice. Even that, and a lot of people miss this too. In the New Testament, one of the things that Jesus calls himself is the chief cornerstone. And so a lot of people think that just simply means he's the firm foundation, or he's what holds the structure of the church up. And yeah, of course it means that. But what he was basically saying is, I am going to be that cornerstone sacrifice instead of you. My shed blood is going to be the cornerstone of what the church is built upon. You're going to build this assembly of believers upon my blood, upon my corpse, so to speak, even though he did raise. And so again, this is something that we miss because we don't understand the culture. And another interesting thing in regards to that, rewinding a little bit in our conversation to the appeasement of the ancestors, A lot of us, who are raised in the church, Abraham was this great patriarch of the faith. And so we just assume that from the day he was born, he was this like born again Christian who sat in a Baptist church, right? But he was actually born in a very secular pagan society. And his father, Terah, actually worked in the employ of Nimrod, the guy who built the Tower of Babel. And, he was a Rephaim, he had secret arcane knowledge. And so Abraham was raised in a home where there were false idols. And you get a lot of this information in the book of Jasher, which is kind of the director's cut of Genesis and part of Exodus. It's the same as it appears in the traditional Bible, but there's a whole bunch of blanks filled in. And so their whole home, they had a room just filled with all these idols. And that was how he was raised. And what's interesting is even when God called him, even when God made that covenant with Abraham, which, by the way, if you read closely, that covenant that was made with Abraham, that his descendants would be as the stars of the sky, Abraham was asleep and he was overcome with darkness in a dream. If you actually read that passage where God made the promise with him, it's very sleep paralysis sounding. But what's interesting is the anxiety that Abraham expresses to God when God says that your descendants will be as the stars. Abraham says, I don't have any ancestors. This guy in my employ is going to have to be my heir. So none of his kids are biologically even going to be mine. And so a lot of people think that what Abraham is worried about there is ancestors. Right. What he's really worried about, and if you go into ancient texts and other texts surrounding this, Abraham was not a Christian. And at this point, he hadn't even been called by God yet. And so he didn't have all of this knowledge of the Torah and all this stuff necessarily. He was raised in a pagan home. And what he was concerned about with not having a son was who is going to perform the ancestral rites every year on my grave. I'm going to be lost for eternity. I don't have a son to come to my grave and perform these rituals and these rites. And so he was fearing for his own soul because he didn't have a concept at that time of a promise or a Messiah. And so again, these are just things that we
and this was a real fear. This was not like, oh, this was the way you were brought up, whatever the culture or the religion was.
Yeah.
And this was a real fear as far as, what happens to you after the death of the physical body.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. This was such amazing insight into, we sit here in the 21st century as people who have heard the gospel a million times. Like we've known from the day we were born, like, hey, here's our escape route. Here's our free pass. We'll pray to receive Jesus. But we've always known that. But think about being in an ancient culture where, nobody's talking about Jesus coming to earth and dying on a cross. And you legitimately think that the preservation of your soul is dependent upon your offspring, and you don't have offspring.
Yes.
A lot of us kind of think, man, why was there such a massive focus in ancient cultures about having to have that son, having that heir, and it wasn't just about your name living on or your inheritance. It was those things, but it was also about, they truly believed that their soul was going to be lost if they didn't have progeny taken care of their dead bones,
Right. Their graves or whatever.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, because before I forget, you mentioned that 2 women had come back to you.
Yes.
How was this revealed to them in a dream? How did they find this out? How did they come into this information?
When people come to me and they ask me, why is this happening to me? So I suggest, and one of the appendices in my book is laying this out. So I call it prayer mapping. You can call it whatever you want. It's just prayer. But what I suggest that people do is you go to an undistracted place, shut the phone off and just really focus. And eventually you're going to pray and you're going to ask, the Spirit of God to reveal to you supernaturally the source, because a lot of times we think we know the source. Oh, I played with a Ouija board in high school. I shouldn't have done that. Oh, I slept with my boyfriend. I had an abortion. I shouldn't have done that. And a lot of people, when they write to me, they self-diagnose what they think let him in. But then what also is inevitable is a lot of these people spend years and years asking to be forgiven over and over and over again for that same thing. And the sleep paralysis persists. And so they think, God's not hearing my prayer. It's like, no, maybe you haven't come to the source. Maybe you think that that's what it is, but it might not even be something that you did. It could be someone in your house that's brought this in. It can be ancestral. Sure. It can be bloodline. It can be if you've had.
You're ahead of the curve, because I was going to ask you. That was my next question.
Yep.
How does the ancestry or the bloodline, whether it's a vow that your ancestor took,
ancestor vows, secret society initiation rites. There are secret societies where you pledge your entire bloodline over to these entities in essence. Right. And so it's not going to be necessarily the first thing that someone thinks of. And so, so what I ask people to do is get alone and just really get a notebook or, whatever you do, and then just write down every single thing that pops into your head that you think could possibly have been an open door. So you exhaust all the obvious things first, all the bad things you did, and then, you start to get more obscure, and then you start to think of more things outside, you start going into concentric circles, like further and further away. And then you use the list, and then you pray through the whole list, and you say these things out loud. And it's sort of like sometimes something will pop off the list at you, and you'll go, I'm kind of getting it. And in fact, I tell people too, if something kind of keeps coming to your mind and you don't want to write it down because you're embarrassed, or you think it's stupid, or you think it's irrelevant, write it down. Because sometimes even that thought that you don't want to write it down is interference. It's someone that doesn't want you to figure it out. And so this happened to me personally. When I first did this, there was something I didn't want to write down because I thought it was so stupid. And so I'm writing down all these like big things, and getting overly complicated and hyperanalyzing everything. And it kept coming to mind to the point where I realized I think I'm actually going to be in disobedience if I don't write it down. It's so dumb, Marlene. I remembered that when I was like 4 years old, which, that's when I said my sleep paralysis started, right? Okay. I had 3 invisible friends. And it just started out innocent, where I got a huge chalkboard for Christmas one year, and I would play school. And so I would sit in my room, because I'm an introvert and stuff. I just liked being by myself. And so I was in my room, and I would, make up names of kids in the class, and I'd write it on the chalkboard. And then I would get my school books, and I would teach, this invisible class. And so at some point, I created this invisible friend who was like a teacher. So she was like my teacher's age. So she was like, a grown woman. And then I started to remember, because I didn't want to write down the invisible friends because I thought it was stupid. So when I finally wrote it down, when I went back and I prayed over it, that leapt out at me. And so I began to ponder it, and I started getting crystal clear, like memory downloads of these 3 friends. And I realized that all 3 of these friends had very specific names, and the names didn't correlate to anyone I knew in real life. So it wasn't like I was naming them after my real teacher or whatever. And these 3 invisible friends did not come at the same time. What happened was, the first one, the woman who was the teacher, she eventually became so mean that I invented a second invisible friend who was like a guy who could ward her off of me and defend me and protect me. But then I found out that invisible friend was two-faced, and he would be nice to me, but he was really in cahoots. So I had to invent a third invisible friend who was 100% authentic. And this played into a very complex fantasy storyline that started out in the sleep paralysis and in the dreams, and then it bled over into my real life, into my playing in my room with my chalkboard. And it wasn't until this point in time, when I was prayer mapping, that I realized that what these 3 invisible friends were teaching me and doing was
Okay.
very similar to the things that happened to MK Ultra mind control patients. It was this sort
Okay.
of abusive like stuff, and it was mean, and it was stuff well beyond my purview of knowledge. And
Right.
it was almost as if I was being groomed and mind controlled without even having to be in that setting.
And it's really weird. They're all adults, is what
Yes.
you saw.
Yes, they were all adults. And so when I specifically prayed over all three of those people by names, thinking, what if I created in those invisible friends, what if I created empty vessels that got filled?
Sure.
And
Sure.
and they played these roles. And so when I was able to pray that over, the sleep paralysis in the classic form that it had always come to me no longer had its power. When the sleep paralysis attacks came to me from that point on, I'd say, in the name of Jesus, get out. You no longer have any power. I have no fear of you. And after a few times, they stopped. And so when I explained all this to the people that, who call me for counseling or whatever, and we go through these things, sometimes they'll come back and tell me, hey, I found the source. Sometimes I never hear from them again and I don't know. But in two
Right.
instances, the women came back and said, I found out what it was and I repented of it and I stopped going and it stopped. And in one case, it's been gone for 3 years, but I could have fallen off my chair with a feather. 2 women came back to me and said it was myofascial release specifically.
So they were able to trace back that point of origin. But sometimes we get so caught up in daily life that it's just speeds by us.
Yeah.
So basically they found they tied down to after this.
Yeah.
That's wow.
And some of it is like I try to get them to like, when did this start? When did the sleep paralysis start? And so kind of try to think in terms of things that might be new. Was there anything new? Did you meet any new people? Do you have a strange coworker that keeps bringing you blueberry muffins? Like things like that. Because, it could be somebody bringing you charged objects or something like that. So,
of course,
you kind of go through these things. And then there was a guy who came to me, and with him, he was just getting massage for back pain. But there was something with that woman that she was starting to astral project into his room and things like that. And he realized it was
You know what? But this is the thing, that it could work in the other direction too.
Sure.
If you're the massage therapist,
yeah,
it goes in the other direction too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where you remember, I'm sure you've heard of it, where they had the sin eater.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. The person who ate the food on the corpse. Yes.
Right. And they would eat, and they basically, they were eating all the sins of the village or whatever.
Yeah. The dead person. Yeah.
Yeah. Or whatever, they in some places, I know they had the dead person, and sometimes they would even have it like, you're going to eat the sins of this little village and take it. Then we're going to drive you off or whatever.
I know. And then they were shunned. These poor guys.
Right. They were shunned. But you know what? You could have somebody, whether it's, if you want to call it a psychic vampire or even a sin eater kind of scenario, where you're taking away more than just the person's, scrunched up muscles. You're taking something from them that you might not want. It does work in the other direction though. It's not like, it's not just the person receiving it. It could go. And the reason why I say this is that you also hear this happening to a lot of people that are first responders, whether they're police or fire rescue, or paramedics, or things like that.
Yeah.
Where nurses, where there's that residue, whatever, because sometimes, how can I say this? Obviously, let's say you work in the medical field. You're going to be impacted because you're going to see, also depending on what department you work in, but you're going to see things that are difficult. People hurting, dying, suffering. But sometimes there's something about certain people, okay, that you get more than what you bargained for.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And I've heard of that happening to people. What is it where they're, if you want to call them a caregiver type of role?
Yes.
Where that more is taken from them than they realize, or something else is given back in return, that exchange stuff.
Yeah.
So there's also, if you want to call it a boundary or something that has to be put up there. That just because you don't see it, almost like what you said, where you were asking them, do do you have a coworker who's baked chocolate chip cookies or something? And after that, it's like everything went sideways. Yeah, because and even most, in a lot of cultures that has that magical thinking, getting somebody to eat something
Yes.
is wow.
Yes.
That'll really put a hook in you, for lack of a better word.
Yes.
As far as
Yes.
if somebody's doing something along those lines. But that's really interesting what you said, that this facial recognition, that they must have. So what happened? They stopped going, and then it
Yes.
stopped, or
Yep. So
okay.
they repented of it, and what's really interesting but not surprising to me is because these were Christian women dealing with Christian practitioners of like physical therapy or whatever, and
Right.
when the one woman in particular went back to the Christian woman and said, do you know that this has origins in Eastern mysticism and New Age, and the poor Christian woman with this successful practice was like, no, like she was kind of mortified, and
Right.
so I don't think, I think that again, even Christians with the best intentions who
Right.
are always studying for like new ways of naturopathic medicine, and
Right.
I'm even careful because like I like to kind of heal as normally and naturally as possible without
Sure.
having to
Sure.
complicate it too much with, because I mean I spent the
Sure.
first 16 years of my life in the hospital. It's not like I'm
Right.
opposed to
Yeah.
it, but it's like I'm just trying to like eat good and figure out good exercises and things. And
Right.
I've just even noticed with some people where I would 1,000% vouch for the authenticity of their faith. Like
Right.
these are definitely believers. And they'll start
Right.
talking to me about stuff that they're taking courses on and that they're going to start integrating. And I'll be like, that's totally New Age, right? No. Not everything that comes from the East is bad, because they had stuff figured out about the body. And I get that. Like, and that's
Right.
why it really, you can't just black or white say every single thing like this is evil. Like, don't even do a
Right.
jumping jack because it could look like a yoga pose. Like, I mean, there's a point where you can get way
I know.
off the beaten track, but
Yes.
it requires discernment. And so like if we are
Yes.
in that field, or if we're seeking things, and I mean we just have to have discernment. And even like when we do get home as introverts and we feel drained, like we need to be in touch with, I was only shopping for an hour. I shouldn't be this tired. I shouldn't feel this drained. And like we have to get better into the practice of being aware of what our body and mind is telling us, and then getting into the habit of when we get home or when we've been with other people to just pray and just say, Father, if I picked up anything, if there was anything, if anything charged, just praying for this protection. And one thing I do now when I wake up is, and this is based on a rather obscure passage in the book of Numbers. There's this obscure story in the book of Numbers where it's talking about making vows to God. And I mean, so this isn't even talking about making covenants or bad vows or bad oaths, but if you make an oath to God, like if you make a vow to God, if you're a man, your word is your word, and there's no way out of it. You've just bound yourself, so be careful what you vow to God, because if you're a man, there's no loophole. But then it says, if you're a married woman or you're a daughter, if your father or your husband hear about this vow, and they don't have to hear about it the day you did it. It says the day that they hear of it. So it could be a week later. If your husband or your father find out about this oath that you made to God, if they don't agree with it, they can disavow you of that oath.
Really?
They can go to God on your behalf and say, this oath is null and void. I did not agree to it. And this isn't to be read in the perspective of a man's telling a woman what to do and you don't get your way. This is a protective thing. Like, you have no idea what you just did. I'm going to protect you from this. Like, you actually got a loophole out of this. You're lucky. So what I do now, because I've come to the conclusion now that sleep paralysis, I believe in many cases can be an abduction, the same way that the UFOs are abductions. Now, a lot of people who have UFO abduction experiences, they will tell you, I have no recollection of what happened, but I know something happened because there's this missing time. So what's very clever about the sleep paralysis experience is that when you wake up 5, 6, 7, 8 hours later after you've gone to bed, no one is looking for missing time because
Right. Oh,
hours have gone by. That's not unusual. And so
exactly.
what I think is kind of scary that I'm starting to sort of explore in my own life, much to my horror, is that because sleep paralysis sufferers have total recall of what all five senses were going through in this heightened sense of trauma and awareness, they can tell you, I woke up at this time, I looked at the clock, it was this color, this is what its eyes looked like, it was by the door, this is what it said. Like they have recall. And so
Right.
what ends up, I think, happening is a lot of us think that because I have such a strong memory of what was happening there in my bedroom, clearly I'm remembering every single bit of this whole experience. But what I think is happening is, I think that in many times, this is my own experience too, and other people will tell me this, the sleep paralysis experience actually starts as a dream. And at some point, the dream goes bad. You're in the dream and something will happen in the dream and you'll go, oh no, this is going to turn into sleep paralysis. But you're deep in a dream. You're not awake. You're not looking at your room. And then in the dream, something demonic starts to happen. And then all of a sudden you're waking up going, Jesus, help me, Jesus, help me. And then it's over. And you're like, phew, close call. What I think is happening is, in many cases, or in some cases, depending on what their motive is for getting a hold of you, I think that when we wake up, it is possible that there's large portions of that sleep paralysis experience that we no longer remember. And
exactly.
Yep. And what they're probably doing is trying to secure that invitation and permission that we were talking about earlier. And I think in many cases, they are duping us into making oaths and covenants. And I could go on and on and on about this.
And I'm going to tell you something that I've learned, that one of the things that people will do, is that your brain, and this is especially when you start talking about childhood trauma or trauma even later on.
Yes.
Okay. What your brain does, or your mind, is to keep you sane.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So that's what sometimes people will not remember things, or when they do remember, sometimes people will not remember things ever.
Yes.
Because at some point, your mind recognizes you will never be able to handle this truth.
Yes.
The recollection of this.
Yes.
Right. Then you'll have people who sometimes weeks, years later will start having, they'll start having weird dreams, like symbolic dreams. It's basically your subconscious trying to tell you, okay, I think you're ready now to get that full recall. All right. And then that's why you'll have people that will have all these recollections all of a sudden that, what? This happened. But there's times, like you said, that if you're never really able to handle what goes on during that sleep time, you will not remember it. In other words, it's not that somebody's not letting you remember. You're not letting yourself remember.
Yes.
Because if you remembered it, you couldn't handle it. In other words, you could, and that's when you get people, with multiple personality, what they call dissociative disorder, DID, blah, 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 blah. Because that's it. There comes a point where the mind says, I can't cover this up. Sorry. And that's when you start getting all that other, mental illness, and it could go horrible ways. But that's usually a product of really deep and systematic abuse.
Yes. But I love that.
In this case, I like that. People don't realize that, sometimes, and they'll even have that in some cases, where you have people that have witnessed a crime.
Yes.
And they'll be asked and they'll say, I can't remember. I can't, but then 6 or 7, even victims themselves, 2 months, 3 months, all of a sudden it starts coming back and they'll say, well, how come you couldn't remember? It's because at that point, your mind was not letting you remember.
Right.
Because you couldn't handle it right then and there.
Yep.
And maybe three months later, it's like, it's okay. Now it's starting to come back.
Yes. And that's where you get all the false memory society.
Oh, well, you also,
like, why are you coming up with this now at 30 years old?
Right. Well, see, this is the thing. The thing with the false memories was tied into hypnosis. Okay.
Yes.
Where people were basically, instead of being asked a certain way, they were being told.
Yes.
Or in other words, they were being given the information.
They're being led.
And basically they wove them a story and it became their story.
Yep.
All right. And that's not the way that's supposed to work with in the sense of memory, recovering memories or anything like that.
Suggestions.
And again, even then, and this is the thing. And then you'll have people, let's say siblings, who have undergone the same trauma.
Yes.
One can handle it and one can't. It's just,
Yes.
that's just the way our emotional makeup is.
Yes.
Some people can handle it and some people can't. Or you'll have one sibling that'll say, well, remember when that and that and that happened? And the other one will go, I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
And you'll like be, okay, somebody's lying here. And it's like, no.
Yeah.
Though maybe the one that can't remember, especially if it was something awful, is because they just cannot handle it.
Yeah.
And they might never, by the way. People sometimes go through a whole lifetime not remembering certain episodes. I'm sure you've heard of people that have whole blocks of their childhood, or they can't remember below a certain age.
Yep.
That you say, how can you not remember that?
Yeah.
And they don't, but it's for a reason usually.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then it gets into the don't wake up a sleepwalker thing. Like if someone can't remember, they are not prepared or ready at that point to remember. So yeah, I love that line of thinking. I love that explanation. I think
it's almost like, what are you ready to accept?
Yeah.
What's your threshold of sanity? How's that?
Yeah.
Of sanity.
The cognitive dissonance. Well,
so that you could handle it.
Exactly. So what I have kind of come to the conclusion of lately is there's probably a lot of things that have happened to me astrally during these encounters that I have no memory of. And so what I do now is when I wake up, I kind of call on that passage in Numbers, and I just say, okay, I'm like, okay, God, if you're presenting yourself to me as my father, and Jesus, if you're presenting yourself to me as a bridegroom, then you're both in the category of being able to disavow me from anything. And so if I agreed to anything in my dreams tonight that I have no memory of, if I made any oaths or covenants, if I gave any invitations or permissions, and if you don't agree with them, I pray that supernaturally behind the veil there, you would advocate as my father or as my bridegroom, and that you would disavow me of any of those vows that I made. And then I just move on with my day and work forward. And I wish I had known that a long time ago, because and I talk about this sometimes. There are Christians out there that talk about how they genuinely are believers. They're 100% on board. They love the Lord. They're in the Word, and they're doing all the things. But there is this absolute inability, no matter what they do, to attach emotionally to God or to Jesus. There's no real joy. There's never any tears. There's worship doesn't move them. And so when I talk to people who have had sleep paralysis their whole life, or these paranormal experiences or these encounters, I do talk about the possibility of if covenants were made, because a lot of these threshold covenants are sort of synonymous in many cases with the betrothal covenants, which is why so many of the I could write a whole book on this. I don't want to get too far off course, but the fact of the matter is sometimes, we can't give our hearts to two. And if there's some sort of covenant there that we don't know about, we have to unbind ourselves from that covenant. And sometimes that's what's blocking that emotional connection to the Lord. We've got all this.
Now, let me ask you something, Vicki.
Yeah.
At what point because obviously you started as a very young child having these experiences.
Yeah.
When was it, or can you remember that there was a point that you that you turned a corner on this with a sleep paralysis?
Yes, it was in my early 30s. And what happened was I hadn't had sleep paralysis for a while. I had a nice intermediary period between age 23, and then it came back again when in my mid 30s. So or
wow.
late 30s.
A long time.
It was. So what happened was, at this point in my early 30s, I had never heard the term sleep paralysis before. It was not in my vernacular. And I believed that I was the only one in the world who had ever had this experience, and that somehow I was being attacked, and that I was I had tried to tell a friend one time when I was 15 about it, and she was very empathetic, and she believed me, and she was very kind. But she came back to school on Monday and told me, oh, I talked to my mom and you're demon possessed and you have to get an exorcism and all this. And so, and I didn't, I didn't,
Oh my God.
I didn't do it, but I thought that said to me at 15 years old, you can't ever speak about this again, because that's
I bet.
so it was my little secret for a while. So I really thought I'm the only one that's ever had this experience. And so I was going to bed one night and I was listening to an apologetics podcast. And the reason I liked this particular podcast is because it was 3 hours long. And so it was one of those things where I could listen to it and fall asleep without having like the tape end, so to speak, and then wake you up.
Right.
So one night the topic was, you know, what is our culture's obsession all of a sudden with all these ghost hunting shows and stuff? I'm like, oh, this is gonna be it'll be a cool one. Right. So I fell asleep and I woke up, you know, an hour or so later, and I'm groggy, so I'm not necessarily remembering that there's a podcast playing, and I'm half asleep. And I actually thought I was having sleep paralysis because I woke up hearing a man perfectly describing my sleep paralysis experience to the detail. And so I'm like, I'm having sleep paralysis. They're mocking me here, you know. And then all of a sudden I kind of came to and realized, like, no, wait, I'm fully awake. This is the podcast. I'm like, I can't believe this. So I kind of like rewound, you know, as best as I could, and was just sitting on my bed at like 2 a.m, listening to this guy perfectly describe my experience. And then the other guys were chiming in and like, oh yeah. And then this and that. And I was like, this is a real thing. Other people have had this. Like, it was this dual emotion of absolute relief and joy that there were other people out there and I wasn't crazy. But then at the same time, absolute terror in realizing that what all these years I had thought were just really bad dreams were really actually some sort of a visitation. So that freaked the crap out of me. But at the end of this, they're like, well, yeah, it's called sleep paralysis. And chills just went all the way up and down my body like 3 or 4 times because I had never heard a name for it. And, you know, this was a while ago. So it's like we had the internet, but I don't even think Google was around yet. So you had to kind of be savvy to find things on the internet because there wasn't really search engines yet. And I found some message boards where people were talking about their experiences. And I spent hours and hours that next day just reading, you know.
And you must have been like, oh my God.
The mother
Isn't
load.
that great? You must have thought, I'm getting picked on. Why me? Why am I the only one that this is happening to?
Yeah, it was so great. So I was just mild. Like, I kind of thought, okay, closure on that. That's now I can put, I can put a period on that and shut that book, and this huge mystery is solved. And I moved on from it. Probably almost 10 years. I didn't think about it again. I didn't, whatever. And then the sleep paralysis started reoccurring around 40 years old when my mom died. And there was a lot of other things going on at that point. So then I got intrigued again. And that was like 10 years ago. And I'm trying to even think the process of writing a book about it really came about unintentionally. I started writing for Real Dark News, realdarknews.com. And it's a news website that's associated with Through the Black and Tom Dunn. It's like a ministry that like exposes the occult. And Tom was a protege of the late Russ Dizdar. And so I started writing for Real Dark News. And so when I first came on board a few years ago, the admin was like, well, why don't you do an article on like sleep paralysis? And I'm like, oh, I can write on this.
Okay, yeah.
And when I went to write the article, I realized, wait a minute, even though I experienced this my whole life, I really can't explain what it is. Like, I really didn't know. And so I really started praying, and it took me weeks of praying with other people, and even doing a little bit of fasting, because I felt like God was telling me, I want you to write on this, but I don't want you to regurgitate anything that's already been said. The stuff out there is kind of a bunch of trash. Like, I want you to really get to the bottom of it. So it took me 3 or 4 weeks before I could even write that article. And
let me ask you something, just real quick.
Yeah.
During that time period between you were asked to do it till you finally started doing it.
Yes.
Did you find that things were occurring to interfere with you completing that?
That is a really,
besides your own fear. Yeah,
that's a really good question. Not that I remember, but it very much could have, and I just don't remember.
Well, it's just procrastination. It could be,
Yes.
but some things are more subtle and some are more overt.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Trying to derail you off that,
Yeah. Yep. Yep. So after I wrote the article, I thought, wow, there's so much more here. And I just started kind of doodling. And so I just kind of started writing a mock book proposal of, what would I, if I was going to write a whole book on this, what would I do? And so I wrote out this whole chapter summary and everything. And then after I got done, I thought, this is kind of good. This has potential. And so I handed the proposal out to about 8 different people. And within about two or 3 months, L.A. Marzulli was one of the guys I gave it to, and he gave me a call and he said, I want to publish this. And I fell off my chair and said, oh, I hope I can write this book.
Right. Right. Because it's like, like they say, and the reason why I asked you is in my experience, sometimes like one door opens, when you, in other words, you would never have gotten to the book proposal idea.
Right.
If you had not first done that article idea.
Yep.
You wouldn't have jumped to the book thing. And that's why I was saying, did you get detoured somehow?
Yes. Oh,
and,
yes.
You'll have people that will say, whether it's procrastination or fear, or, or what they call life gets in the way, or sometimes actual crises happen.
Massive periods of writer's block.
Or they just get derailed. And sometimes it takes a while for people to look back and say, you know what? I think somebody sabotaged me. I know. Because that's the only way to look at it. When you look at certain things that occur, that either stop it or delay it.
Yes.
And it's really weird, but sometimes only in hindsight can you see that.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's interesting though, that you just pursued it, and then from there you stepped off and did the book.
Yeah, it was great. It was a neat experience. Just but it did from the point of having the proposal accepted to the book coming out, it was over 3 years. And like when we tried to send it to the printer, it took almost a year because of all the delays. First it was COVID, then it was a supply chain error. Then the printers got hacked and lost all their stuff. And then every single one of their printers across the United States came back online, except the location that had my book. I'm not joking.
What a coincidence.
I know. So it took, I think, close to a year from the time we sent the manuscript to the printer to actually get, and then when we ordered it, they had a whole entire shipping error they boxed everything wrong, and then they had to rebox it, but then they wouldn't do it because it was a holiday, so then it delayed it even more. It was one thing after
you must have. See, and sometimes that's what I'm saying. You look, maybe when while it was going on, you say, well, it's just aggravating. But then when you look back, and sometimes you see a pattern, it's like, okay, all right, somebody's putting their finger on the scale, kind of thing. Like, okay, somebody here is like, and sometimes things like that happen. And you could say, okay, you're seeing things where there isn't.
Yeah.
But sometimes,
things
happen to basically, whether it's simple distraction.
Yes.
All right. Get distracted, or it's like, oh, okay, simple distraction isn't going to work because this person really wants to do this. Really wants. So we have to really lay it on heavy. Let's see what we could do. Let's see what we could throw in there.
Yep, absolutely.
It can come in a variety of forms.
Yes,
Vicki, it has been absolutely wonderful to talk to you. I could spend another 2 hours talking to you.
I know. Like, okay, this is a jackpot.
I'm telling you, I really loved it because you bring I don't want to say an angle, but that's what it is, to the sleep paralysis and that whole, whether you want to call it and I'm sure you've heard of the Hat Man and Shadow Man and all these things that people experience.
Yes.
That goes beyond the, this happened and they just think it's like, it's a bad experience.
Yeah.
But you see the agenda, in other words, behind it.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting.
This is more than eating spaghetti before you go to bed.
Oh no, absolutely. And that's the thing, And by this, I'm not saying people can have nightmares which have nothing supernatural and nothing to do. Everybody, that is people, sometimes nightmares help you work out your fears,
Absolutely.
and you just do that shadow boxing in your head or something. Sometimes you're worried about something, and before you know it, you have a bad dream about it. It's
Yeah.
not like, but what you described, even what that thing that you said that you had when you were 4 years old of 3 adults.
Yeah.
Okay. And when you're telling me, I was like, okay, they're doing the bad cop, good cop on her.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, they were.
You know,
Oh
it's
my
like, of
God.
course you were a child. You were a child.
Yeah.
But yeah. And then it's like, this is like, and so unusual to have adults, but yeah, it's very interesting as far as that you could remember this far back,
Yeah.
and that you were able to, even at that age,
Yeah.
realize, okay, there's something here that's not right, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Again, Vicki, it has been absolutely great to speak to you, and I want to wish you the best of luck. By the way, do you have any other books planned?
Yes, I do. Thank you for asking. I actually just started research this week for book number 2. Ellie Marzulli is going to publish that one as well. Hopefully, this one
Okay.
won't take 3 years, but we're going to be delving kind of in the same direction because I have an idea for book 3, so I want to kind of like lead there. But
Right.
I think things change. Sometimes projects, once you get into them, they change drastically. But we're going to sort of be exploring how the media, children's media in particular, is using media as a vehicle to teach and expose people to the occult.
Absolutely.
And so that'll be fun. And but this book, they only come out at night. It is
Yes.
only available on lamarzulli.net. It is not on
Okay.
Amazon or anything. So if anyone
Okay.
is interested in they only come out at night, that is they only come out on lamarzulli.net.
Let me ask you, what is your website? This is for my podcast listeners, because I'll have a link to the credits of the show, but for the podcast listeners, what's your website?
Yep. It's VickiJoyAnderson.com. That's Vicki with an I and Anderson with the SON ending. And
Okay.
I got all sorts of other books and stuff on that site. If you go to the media
Okay.
tab, you can go to all the other podcasts and shows and stuff I've done. And Vicki Joy Author is my Instagram handle.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. So again, okay. So when are you planning to do you think that you're going to have that book done?
Ooh.
The other one, am I next year or no?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you never know with books. And so,
I know.
but like I said, I have started the research. And so the writing, once I'm in the writing mode, the easiest and the fastest part of the process for me is writing the book. It's
Right.
But then it gets out of your hands with, like, you don't know how long the editor's
Right.
going to take, and the drafts and the publisher and the printer and all that stuff.
Right.
So,
like you've learned already.
yeah,
That sometimes
exactly.
it's once it leaves your hands.
That's right. But as far as it depends on me, I'm going to kick it into high gear.
Of course. Again, thank you so much, and all the best to you.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care. Happy
You
New
too.
Year. Merry Christmas.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow. Okay. I'm like, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that have heard, of course, of sleep paralysis, or in one version of it, you have the I've heard versions where people have the sleep paralysis. They don't see something, but they sense something is in the room with them. Other people do see something. I've heard of people say some people will have the Hat Man or the Dark Shadow or the some version of that. All right. I've heard people sometimes have seen horrific things as part of the sleep paralysis, and other people it's just the actual sleep paralysis, but they feel something evil. And I'm going to use the E word because I'm not trying to be dramatic, but so much so that it's not like, oh, you know how sometimes, let's say you fall asleep on your arm, or and it's kind of like it doesn't move, and you're like, oh my God, it's uncomfortable, but you're not scared. It's just like, oh, my arm fell asleep because I fell asleep on top of it, or I had a certain position where the circulation cut off. Yeah, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about sleep paralysis where the person cannot sleep. I mean, cannot move. You can't move. And they will, if they don't see or they feel like there's a presence, you hear it described as a presence of something evil. All right. And one of the things that you get from people that have described these experiences, like, I wasn't dreaming, I was fully awake, because it's like I was hyper awake, as a matter of fact, because almost like, when you get scared that all your senses sharpen up, people get into that. It's like, I know perfectly well that I'm not asleep because I'm totally aware I can't move my body, but I can see everything. Maybe if depending on your position that you're in, you can even look and see what, if you've got that most people don't have nowadays, but a clock or something that you could make out even what time it is. Um, in other words, you're hyper awake. Because you get people that say, "Well, you were just having a bad dream," and they're like, "No, no, no, it wasn't a bad dream." So yeah, they some people will have that version of it, and I have heard of people having it reoccurring, but not as Sometimes I've heard of people having it when they've lived at certain places that leads you to believe, was there something there? Like, in other words, they were having the sleep paralysis. They move away to another place and the sleep paralysis stops. Now, what could be causing it to begin with, or was it something there in particular of that location? Because in her case, what she's describing is she's had these episodes of sleep paralysis throughout her life, and I'm sure it sounds like she's moved. She's not in the original place where she lived at when she was a child. All right. So it's one of those weird things that everybody has some individual version of it. And I'm glad she described it, that she went through that period where she didn't have it. And then, because she answered before I was even able to ask, which is what triggered it. Okay, you're not a child. But see, when you're a child, there's this feeling of helplessness, basically. And a lot of times, what a child is looking for is a protector, especially if they feel unsafe, which to her, it might have been like she said that her parents couldn't be there. Maybe she was in a hospital setting and her parents couldn't be there constantly. And a child is a child. A child doesn't logic that. So maybe there were moments that she wanted a protector. But when she was an adult, fast forward so many years, and I'm glad she explained that everything returned with the death of her mom and other things that were going on in her life. And sometimes this is the fear being the key, what did I say, the common denominator. This is why sometimes even people that have a tendency to sleepwalk, they usually will do it when they're anxious, or uh have something pressing them, like really worrying them. And that they don't know how to turn off the thing that keeps us from basically moving around when we dream. Sometimes you'll have that. It's usually anxiety, fear, and if you want to say that opens a doorway, of course it does. All right, of course it does. And she gave a lot of explanations for a lot of things that I'm sure some people will agree with. Some people will go, I don't buy that. But you have to look at everything. I do believe, regardless of what your beliefs are, whether it's spiritual beliefs, religious beliefs, belief in the way life is or isn't, that we keep trying to divorce spirituality from everyday life, as in what I can feel, see, touch. And and by this, I'm not talking about religious beliefs. I'm talking spiritual beliefs. Whatever religion you have, if you have one, how's that? And we try to divorce them, and either it's here, and even if you believe in one and the other, but still they're totally separate. All right. And I think that there's a lot in this world that just because we don't see it, or that our five senses don't pick up on it, doesn't mean it's not there or it affects us. All right. And some of these things are static. And I think a lot of research that's been done into physics will explain a lot of things as far as what maybe our eyes don't understand or see. There's something in us that recognizes it. But here we're talking, how can I say, things that are not not sentient. Okay, now what she's talking about is something that's sentient that tries to reach us. And I'm sure a lot of people will hear how when they've seen ghosts or had paranormal, and I'm not by this, I'm not talking sleep paralysis. I'm talking like that they've seen a ghost or they've had. You'll have a lot of people, and I have heard of these cases. People have told me it's when people are asleep or they wake up. That's why you'll have people that, I'm sure you've heard of ghost encounters where they were asleep and they wake up and they see somebody at the foot of their bed, or they see somebody in the other part of the house. In other words, it's almost like when that point where you bring down the chatter in your mind and everything comes down, that it's almost that accessibility that's when it's most possible. And I think that um and I it's just because your mind it's just different. It's quieted down. How's that? Which, by the way, if you think about it, that's the intent of a lot of times of meditation, is to quiet your mind. In other words, quiet it so that you're not doing the to-do list. You're not thinking of, on my phone and now, and I've got a call and the appointment and tomorrow. Let me see if I can. All right. In other words, it's that moment of quietness that which, by the way, is very, for the creative person, is very good. Some of the best ideas I've come up with have been when I wake up in the morning, or I'll remember stuff and I'll go, oh my God, I can't remember. Or I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. It's almost because it's almost like you've given your brain or your mind that time to, like, everybody else get out of the way so I can tell you, hey, remember this? Or, hey, have you thought of that? My point being, though, that openness or that freshness is also, if what Vicky's describing, is sometimes will allow that communication where maybe you will be drawn in. If you want to, I don't want to know if you want to call it a dimension or what they call the middle plane or something like that, where everything is there. I want to say it's like the Wild West. You got the outlaws and you got the sheriff and everything in between, where whatever's there converses with you and tells you what you want to hear. Maybe even knows better than you do what you truly want or what you fear. And it's like, it's like, and everybody's different. Everybody's different, and basically they tell you, or you hear. And then if you have how can I tell you, it's like, let's face it, we're all I think it's part of human nature. We're all can fall to flattery in different ways, whether you're told you're important or you're wanted or you're beautiful or you're whatever, you're smart, or you're talented. I mean, we all fall for it. Okay, no matter what. Um, and like what I said, that's when the seduction starts. If according to what she's saying, which I'm not ready to discount it either way. I mean, that's a very, very deep subject. A very deep subject. When you start thinking about what happens when we go to sleep, um, where exactly do we go? When I say we, as in not physically, obviously, because you're in your bed, but if you want to call it your etheric body, or your soul, or your spirit, or your whatever, where does it go? What does it do? No. Who does it converse with when it's out there? What does it see? Is it, because you're always thinking, well, how can I say this? Even if you're a full grown adult and you could even consider yourself cynical, like, oh, I've heard it all. Sometimes in that state, what's the thing? Everybody has a chink in their armor. There's always a way to, like when you're trying to open the package, that all you need is a little hole so that you can start going, and then you open it up. I think everybody has a chink in their armor. Some people more than others, but but again, if you don't, if there's, if in other words, if you're not there to listen, it doesn't matter what they have to say. What I'm saying, they, as an, I don't know what they is. All right. If you don't lend an ear, it doesn't matter, because I'm not there to listen to it. Sorry. It's one of those deals. And I do agree with her, which we said about it, as far as, and I've talked about in other shows, as in the supernatural, in the metaphysical, in the paranormal, what is seen as an invitation. It's like almost like an exchange kind of deal. And I'm sure, once upon a time when people were like, if you received an invite, let's say even if you received an invite for dinner, people would not come to your dinner empty-handed. And this was before BYOB or BYO. It was expected that you would come with some gift or something for the host or anything, because there was always, how can I say it? It wasn't just a question of etiquette or manners. It was like there was always an exchange. And you see that across different cultures. Okay, it's not because you say Western culture. No, you see that in a lot of cultures where there was always an exchange of whatever it was. Sometimes it was a physical thing. In some cases, you will have heard of people that you saved their life and basically they owed you the same. Their life belonged to you, or they had to do, in other words, for them to be square with you, they had to give you back something of equivalent value. All right. My point being that when you start that, in other words, nothing can happen. There can be no exchange, no invitation, no offer, no agreement if you don't listen. Okay. Because like she said, if there's no exchange, if we don't talk about something, somebody shows up at your house and wants to come in and you're like, what are you doing here? You can't, get out of here. All right. And usually before the invitation, there has to be an exchange of whatever. Mm-hmm. Somebody listens. Same thing. Think of the best salespeople that you know. All right. All they need is for you to give them a little bit of time for you to listen to them. If they can't give you the pitch, that they know, they're toast. They're done. You're never going to do anything or buy or whatever the case might be. All they're looking for. That's why sometimes you will see some of these shows, even infomercials, or even some other shows that, you're thinking, oh, wow, this is great. This is for free. That's a great show. But in the meantime, basically what they're doing is, okay, all we're doing is, we know we were buying your attention so that in the meantime, we will be able to sell you something. How? Because we're going to get you to listen to it. And I'm sure you've seen some of those early morning, 3, 4 in the morning infomercials where sometimes they'll bring on, it's almost like a talk show kind of setting. And they'll bring in some expert or experts, and they'll start talking about things that are really important, like your health. You know that the body works this way, and we have found through studies that and by the way, what they're presenting, I'm not saying is not true. Okay, but of course they have the solution. That's the sales pitch. The same thing. If you don't listen to it, nobody's going to sell you anything. Now, the question is, how do you not have that exchange with whatever? I mean, let's go down that rabbit hole, shall we? Interesting. Very interesting. Anyway, guys, I hope you liked this interview. I really loved it. I'm going to bring her back again. Visit her website. And like she said, okay, her name is Vicki Joy Anderson, but her book is only available through L.A. Marzulli's website. And you're not going to find it on Amazon or Barnes & Nobles or anything like that. I'm sure she probably does have a link from her website over to where you can buy the book. And again, the name of the book, I'm going to tell you right now, is They Only Come Out at Night, Exposing the Dark Weapon of Sleep Paralysis. And as a matter of fact, L.A. Marzulli did the forward for her on this book. All right. So again, go to mppellicer.com, miamighostchronicles.com, and you'll have a link from there over to Substack. Again, if you want to listen to any of my podcasts, I have all my episodes from the first one. If you want to listen to them for free, no commercial interruptions, you can go to them and you can search for them, whether by topic or if you have a certain guest that you like. You can listen to it on the browser. You can download the MP3 file. There you have access to just about anything. Or if you want to jump over to any of the podcast platforms, maybe you have a favorite one, iHeartRadio. I'm on that. I'm on Spotify. I'm on Spreaker. I'm on iTunes. I'm on all the major. Another one I just joined was Podbelly. Just look for Stories of the Supernatural, which is this show, or Nightshade Diary, like I said, which is your adventure, mystery, horror stories from yesteryear, or Supernatural Story Time, which is just firsthand scary stories, people talking about experiences they've had with the weird. Again, till next time, thank you so much for coming and spending this time with me. And come back. I have a lot of great guests that are going to leave you going, huh? Till then, take care.